Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.
Alysanne Lefford Targaryen had seen her husband do many terrible things since she had become the de facto queen of the Iron Throne, so what had just happened didn't surprise her as it would others. She had entered the Solar through a side door leading to her and her husband's chambers before even Jaehaerys had arrived, staying in the shadows of the corner as her son and husband argued. She knew it was coming, this showdown over Lyanna Stark. But even she hadn't expected it to go as it had. One hand on her swollen stomach, knowing that any day now her seventh child would be born, she approached her husband's broad back as he stared motionlessly down the hall the boy they had raised fled down. With a gentle touch she laid her other on his shoulder, Aelor not even flinching when her small hand lay on the muscle underneath. "I have driven him from us, Allie." Aelor's voice was soft and vulnerable in a way she hadn't heard in years, and her heart went out to him. "No, you haven't." Jaehaerys is young and confused, facing the woman he has shied from for 16 years. He isn't thinking clearly. It was as if she hadn't even spoken. "I have been readying myself for that confrontation for years, but all he had to do was bring her up and I react like a boy his age." Alysanne sighed, working her way around to his front and pressing herself as close as her pregnant stomach would allow, using her hands to reach high above her head to cradle his face. "You lost your temper for a moment, so did he. You will reconcile. She has been dead over 16 years, yet the mere mention." Alysanne shifted one of her hands to cover his lips, shushing him. "I know, Aelor, I know. I have lived in her shadow for that long." Aelor's eyes finally looked down at her, guilt flashing through them. She pulled him down into a kiss. "I knew what I was getting into when I married you, Aelor Targaryen." Aelor rested his forehead against hers. Eyes closed. "Was he right? Am I as bad as Lyanna Stark?" Alysanne hesitated a moment, knowing what she needed to say but unsure exactly how to say it. Her husband had been a good man once, before the war that had taken half his family and nearly every soul he could call friend, not to mention the woman he had loved. Part of that good man still existed beneath the walls of ruthlessness and hate. Alysanne saw it more than any other being ever had. In the way he treated his children, both of birth and choice, and allies. But her husband certainly wasn't the same good being he had once been, even Alysanne knew. In truth, he was every bit as mad as his brother had been, just in his own more subtle and much more deadly way. She chose her words carefully, stroking his cheek as she spoke. Lyanna was a young girl, a spoiled young girl. She certainly played a part in starting the war. Aelor kept his forehead to hers, clearly waiting for more, but when it didn't come, he slowly raised back up to his full height. But Alysanne let her hand stray to his broad chest, knowing she had to tread carefully. Aelor valued her counsel above any other, even above Barristan's, and she couldn't give him a reason to doubt her, but she had never told him anything but the truth before, and she didn't intend to start now. Lyanna is no innocent. She is certainly a large cause of the war. But Aelor, she isn't the only one. Your father drove the Lord Paramounts to the edge. Rhaegar and Lyanna pushed them over. Your family played as big a role as any foolish, noble girl, your father much more of one. You're blaming Lyanna because she is the only one left to blame. You have forgotten the true story behind it all. Aelor stared at her violet eyes, unwavering. Alysanne met them. 16 years with the man had taught her how to handle him. Still, apprehension took a firm grip on her, and she subconsciously lay a hand on her belly. Though not from fear of violence from Aelor. He loved her and his children much too much to ever lay a seriously damaging hand on any of them. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, much softer than usual. "I haven't forgotten, Alysanne. I never will, no matter how much I might want to. I can still smell Rickard Stark burning, can hear Brandon choking, can see Lannisport burning to the ground. It may be years in the past, but it is as vivid in my mind as yesterday." He turned away from her to look back at the flipped desk and broken glass, though he kept one large hand resting against her ribs. "I hate Lyanna Stark as much as Rhaegar claimed to love her, and nothing will ever change that. But I may have been rash in not giving Jaehaerys more choice. While I never forbade him from seeing her, the entire keep knew of my thoughts on the matter." Alysanne sighed a quiet exhalation of relief. "He is smart and just, but he is a boy. I have never met a 15-year-old boy who could see past whatever it was he was feeling then. I will speak with him in the morning, shed some light on all of this." Aelor chuckled lightly, turning to engulf her in the arms she was so used to. "You're a better woman than I deserve, Alysanne Lefford. I advise you never forget it." She rested her head against his broad chest once more. "I am right, love, you will see." For the first time in Aelor Targaryen's life, his wife had been wrong. The dragon of Duskendale stood in the doorway leading to his favorite balcony in all the Red Keep, watching the rain splatter against the stone. Another time was heavy on his mind in that moment. a memory a lifetime ago when he had stood in the night air with the smell of a dead man's burning flesh swirling in his nostrils, his black-bearded best friend beside him. It had been that night that he had known he was going to war, a war that had changed him and hundreds of others forever. But that night had been 17 years ago. Now it was the middle of the day, the sky filled with gray rain clouds but still plenty light, his nostrils filled not with the smell of burning flesh but with the smell of fresh rainfall, albeit tempered with the stench of the city of his birth. Instead of a giant of a man standing beside him, he had a small bundle clutched to his broad chest, blankets swaddled around its occupant to ward off the increasing chill. Alyssa Targaryen, named after her maternal grandmother, had arrived 2 days after the conclusion of the tournament of Duskendale in the bright hours of the morning. She was small but healthy, and though it could easily change as the child grew, she seemed to be an image of her mother. Though he loved his sons, those he had sired as well as those he had taken in his heart, black as it may be, had a soft spot for girls. He didn't know if it was due to how much Rhaenys had helped him cope with the death of Aaliyah or not, but he could deny them nothing, be they Daenerys or Rhaella or Sarah or even Rhaenys to this very day. In his experience, daughters caused a lot less trouble than boys. The day before Alyssa had come squalling into this world, Rhaenys Targaryen had rode north with the Starks. Alysanne had not been entirely wrong, for the boy had not turned his back on the family that raised him as Aelor had accused, giving heartfelt goodbyes and promises of return to them all. He'd hugged his mother in all but name long and hard, ruffled Baelin's hair and pinched Sarah's nose. He'd promised to return home soon after he had spent time with the family that he had been estranged from since birth. That had been 5 months ago, and Rhaenys was still at Winterfell. He'd sent packets of letters to the capital for them all, and another to Highgarden and his sister. He spoke of snow, something he had never seen, of blue winter roses that Aelor remembered vividly at Harrenhal, and of a direwolf pup and its litter mates found beside their dead mother. Only Aelor had received nothing. The boy, who despite his mature outward appearance was still very much so a boy, clearly still disgruntled from the explosion of emotions that had come to a head at Duskendale. Aelor hadn't slept well since. Torn between sending a letter explaining his position, Rhaenys, riding to Winterfell himself, or doing nothing. But as much as it pained him, his estrangement from his nephew was the least of his concerns. Dark wings had brought dark words. Aelor was a self-admittedly cynical man, openly skeptical of mages and sorcerers and their proclaimed powers. He even wondered at the Seven, finding in his experience that sword and fire ruled the world. Not a father and mother and their demanding, vicious companions. But the Prince of Duskendale had seen too much in his time to deny that there was more to the world than mortal men could comprehend. His brother Rhaegar, however mad or brilliant or in between he truly had been, had foreseen things a man should not have been able to know. The eldest son of Aerys had known he would fall at what was now known as the Ruby Ford, even if he hadn't been sure how. He'd known Aelor would drive the rebel forces back despite the odds against them. And Aelor had, though no soul on either side could call the Battle of the Trident a victory. He'd even prophesied Aaliyah's death and tried to prevent it, though he had failed in doing so. Aelor to this day didn't know what had given his brother his foresight or how. Whether there were truly gods or not, Aelor couldn't say, but he knew there was more to the world than the swords and men he understood. So when ravens had brought word from the wall of a wilding army numbering in the thousands and of the giants rumored to be in their number, Aelor hadn't scoffed as others had. No, the prince had instead felt an aura of unease fall over him, one that still clung to him now. It wasn't that First Ranger Benjen Stark was missing, a fact that Lord Eddard had informed him of during their stay in Duskendale. Nor was it the disappearance of Waymar Royce, Bronze Yohn's youngest son. That bothered him so. Men of the Watch had a dangerous occupation, and more than one had been claimed by the Wilds while out on patrol. It was the fact that several veteran members of the Watch, strong and stubborn men, were fleeing south mad with fear that concerned the Dragon of Duskendale. Some of those veterans were as tough as Aelor himself and wouldn't scare easily. But scare they had. Lord Eddard had executed 3 himself in the last year. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont had stressed his belief that the Wildings were the only true threat in his messages, but he had mentioned the rumors out of duty. And those rumors, even if they concerned old ghost stories and wives' tales, were what concerned the Dragon of Duskendale, Whites and others. Myths supposedly, but if something were to manage to scare those men of the Watch, Aelor imagined it might be that. Aelor hoped and prayed that it wasn't the case. He knew how to kill a man wearing steel and brandishing a sword. Demons of ice, forgotten in the thousands of years since the stories were first told, were another matter entirely. The council was to meet that afternoon concerning the messages. Aegon was taking them far more seriously than Aelor had suspected the boy would, something the prince was glad for, but it was clear he thought the part of White Walkers to be nothing, and was instead intent on confronting the growing wildling numbers. His nephew was eager to win glory on the battlefield, egged on by his son Ren and their close friend Aelor, three boys with no idea what war truly meant, no matter how much Aelor and Barristan and the others had tried to tell them. It reminded Aelor of himself and Renfred when they were that age. Tyrion Lannister, Lord Paramount of the Westerlands, would be arriving any hour now, appointed to replace Wyman Manderly as Master of Coin. The massive bellied Northman in his advancing age, requesting to return to White Harbor to live out the remainder of his life with his family. Aegon had made the appointment of the Lion Dwarf, having found the Halfman's wit entertaining despite the history between their two families, and Aelor had endorsed it even though he still despised the Lion banners with all his being. Stannis Baratheon, the master of ships ever since Quellen Greyjoy had died 10 years past, would be arriving soon as well, having sailed from Storm's End after returning there for the birth of his second son with Lady Arnett Swan. The council would hear the messages again as well as the words of the Watch recruiter Yoren, who had traveled to King's Landing to clear out the dungeons and give an eyewitness account of the happenings north of the Neck. Aelor was confident in Nephew's ability to handle this situation well, and he would argue vehemently in favor of aiding the Watch if the council disagreed. The situation should be well in hand, but something was still nagging at Aelor, something he couldn't place his finger on. The prince held his youngest daughter closely and continued to watch the rain crash to the earth, wondering if he was once again on the brink of war, and how many of his house would survive this one. Viserys Targaryen stared into the glass of ale before him, mind screaming with rage, his constant companion for nearly half a year. He was a prince, the blood of the dragon. His place was in King's Landing, his sister by his side as was the Targaryen way, not in this dingy tavern in the slums of Tyrosh, waiting for that blasted incompetent fool Aleku Garantes to return with his next allowance. He didn't understand his wretched brother and nephew's denial of what was his by right. Aelor had waived any right to Daenerys the day he married that slut Alysanne Lefford, and his children were no true blood of the dragon for it. The Targaryen line must remain pure, they were gods, not peasants. None of them saw it except him. None of them were smart enough. He could be the savior of the Targaryen line, the one who turned them around, but they had denied him that, sending him instead to waste away in this city of peasant filth and heresy. And for what? Removing an insignificant insect of a Marcher Lord. It was true he had waited a tourney lance in hopes that overreaching lout Bryce Caron would challenge him, intent on removing the true threat for his sister's hand. It was the way of the world. Viserys was a Targaryen, and Targaryens removed threats and rivals bloodily. His brother's hypocrisy was what truly irked the Prince of Summerhall, as if Aelor, the famed dragon of Duskendale, hadn't destroyed an entire house for crossing him not even a decade after having nearly done the same to one of the oldest and most powerful houses in all of Westeros. Fire and blood were the Targaryen words, not flowers and brandy. Yet Aelor and his family grew fat and lazy in King's Landing while Viserys brooded in the corner of a foreign city. Daenerys is mine by right. I will have her one way or another. But be damned if he had figured out just how. He didn't acknowledge the figures that suddenly sat at the table with him. It happened from time to time, men trying to curry favor with the rulers across the sea by flattering Viserys until they learned he was exiled and in disfavor, disappearing as soon as they did. The Prince of Summerhall had taken to ignoring them, all unworthy fools not fit to lick his boots. The figures didn't leave, seemingly waiting for the prince to speak. Viserys didn't, and eventually one of them decided to prompt him. "Are you Viserys Targaryen?" asked a deep voice. And the only reason Viserys looked up to acknowledge him was the Westerosi accent. A broad-shouldered, tall man sat across the table from him, his arms covered in golden rings. The man was ugly, eyes bloodshot and face pockmarked, but he held himself with the bearing Viserys recognized in men of noble blood. Two figures stood on either side of him, the man's brothers Viserys judged from their similar features to the lout in front of him. Still, if Viserys had learned anything in exile, it was to proceed cautiously. "Who wants to know?" The man smiled slightly, something that somehow made him look even uglier than he already did. "I am Lord Laswell Peake, formerly of Westeros, now of the Golden Company. These are my brothers Pycuid and Tormund." The Targaryen prince raised an eyebrow. "What is it you want exactly? I am not in favor with the king in Westeros." Laswell Peake's smile grew and his brothers mirrored it on either side of him. "No. But how would you like to be the king in Westeros?" Aemon Targaryen knew he shouldn't be here, but he simply couldn't stay away. The second son of Aelor didn't like people. Well, that wasn't completely true, he didn't like being around people. His older brother could talk to anyone, even girls, but Aemon was far different from Renler. He'd never been comfortable around people who weren't his family, and half the time he wasn't even comfortable around them. People were unpredictable, driven by goals Eamon didn't understand, and they talked so buggering much. Books were different. They were small, stationary, quiet. They were exactly where you knew they were when you wanted them and could be left without any need of explanation, which suited Eamon perfectly. But they were also so much more than that. Books told of times long past, of heroes and villains and the feats of honor and horror they carried out. They spoke of battles long past and the glories won there. They told stories of chivalry and valor, of brutality and deception. They let you become another being without the need to rise from your seat. Aemon had conquered the world with Aegon Targaryen, had pillaged with Harwin Hardhand, had slogged through the blood and mud of the Trident with his father, all from the confines of the Red Keep. A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one. Aemon had discovered his love for books even as Grandmeister Calmer, perhaps the only non-Targaryen Aemon liked, was first teaching him how to read. He discovered the hidden tunnels of the Red Keep not long after. They were excellent for disappearing to be with himself and his books, to curl up in one of the innumerable nooks and live another life for a few hours. There were others who used them, children his age and younger, Varys' little birds, but they left him be. And he did the same for them. Being in the tunnels lead to some interesting opportunities, to be sure. He could listen in on any number of conversations if he were of a mind. But Aemon wasn't of a mind he wanted to be. Left alone, so he tended to leave others alone as well. Except for today. Today he simply had to listen. The stories of the Long Night fascinated him. The tales of men and White Walkers and their war for the dawn were considered nothing more than legend, spoken of in stories but not truly believed by anyone south of the Neck, or even many of those north of it. It was mentioned in the same breath as Lan the Clever or Brandon the Builder, stories that were more myth than legend. Whether or not others ever had, or maybe still did, walk the north of Westeros was beyond Aemon's knowledge, but the tales of terror and heroism spoken of in the stories of them fascinated him. And now it seemed they might be coming again. He knew he should be terrified, and part of him was, but part of him was also breathless at the idea. An utterly ridiculous notion, what with the potential for the end of the world and all, but one he couldn't help. It wasn't like he would be the hero to fight the others back if there truly was a second battle for the dawn anyway. Aemon was no warrior, and he didn't pretend to be. He had no skill for swordplay and no desire to improve upon it. Once he had been ashamed of that fact. Ren was a solid swordsman, and his little austere brother Balin was already deadly and unstable. But that was a concern for another time. And of course there came the fact of his parentage. Aelor Targaryen was considered the best, or at the very least the deadliest, bladesman this side of the Kingsguard. It was perhaps foolish but nonetheless natural to assume all of his sons would be skilled as well. 2 out of 3 so far isn't too bad, I suppose. I'm sure Daemon will make it 3 out of 4 when he comes of age. Aemon's thoughts trailed off when he heard Aegon call the small council meeting to order. The voice was muffled and seemed to come from different directions. Aemon had never been sure exactly where the hidden niche was in relation to the small council chamber, but he could understand his cousin plainly enough. "Good morning, my lords." There was a grumble of returned greetings, from Varys chittering to Calmer the Grey's deep bass. "I'm sure we all know precisely why we are here. Another raven arrived from Lord Stark early this morning," the Grandmeister said. "The North is taking Lord Commander Mormont's warnings seriously. Eddard Stark and his son are gathering 10,000 Northmen to ride to the Wall's aid." There was a slight hesitation, and when the giant with the deformed face spoke again his voice was a shade quieter. "Prince Jaehaerys will ride with them." Aemon strained to hear if his father had anything to say about that, but the Dragon of Duskendale kept his silence. He wasn't entirely sure just what had gone down between the two. His father refused to discuss it, and no reference of it was made in any of Jaehaerys' letters. Yet it was clearly evident something had gone down between them, for anyone with eyes could see there was something off-kilter in the Targaryen dynasty. Something beyond the exile of Viserys, which, while no one said it aloud, the family was more thankful for than depressed by. Of course, we're Targaryens. Something is always off-kilter in our bloodline. Ah yes, the ominous threat of giants and snarks from beyond the wall, came the cheery-toned voice of Tyrion Lannister, attending his first small council meeting after replacing the massive Lord Wyman Manderly. The dwarf Lannister was known for his quick wit and willingness to bed anything female, seeming to have settled for life as a bachelor, and accepting his uncle Kevan and his sons as his heirs. While his diminutive size made things difficult for him as a ruler, as did his apparent loyalty to the dynasty that had destroyed 9/10 of his own, His mind was brilliant, a fact even Aelor had made mention of before. That fact alone bore the truth of the statement. For his father to compliment anything Lannister was a rare occurrence. He had, after all, gone on a bloody crusade to wipe the bloodline out a decade and a half earlier, nearly succeeding before something had stayed his hand. He suspected that something had been his mother, Alysanne. She was the only person Aemon had ever seen talk her father down when he was angry. "I'm less worried about the Snarks and the Giants than I am the Wildlings, Lord Tyrion," replied the king. Reports placed their numbers at over 50,000. Another voice spoke, grim and unforgiving. Those traits by themselves could be either Chief General Randyll Tarly or Master of Ships Stannis Baratheon, but Aemon quickly identified it as the latter. Reports normally stray far from the truth, especially when concerning enemy numbers. The Lord Paramount of the Stormlands was a hard man, strong and utterly unyielding. He had resorted to eating boot leather rather than surrender during his brother's rebellion, only yielding when Lord Stark had arrived to vouch for Aelor Targaryen's leniency. Rumor had it that even that hadn't been enough. The true reason behind the steely-eyed man's capitulation concern for his child brother Renly. Aemon wondered if Stannis regretted that now. His brother was a charming, handsome man who instilled love in his followers in a way Stannis never had. He was also blisteringly ambitious, having left Stannis' court when his heir Steffan, his second of 3 children behind the girl Shireen and before the newborn Lionel, had been born. Renly had taken up residence at Highgarden with the Tyrells, wooing the girl Margaery as well as forming a close friendship with her brother Loras. The Knight of Flowers. Many wondered if he was working behind the scenes to garner support for a potential coup of Stannis, though how young Renly intended to pull it off when his elder brother clearly had favor with the Targaryen dynasty was unclear. "I realize reports are by nature unreliable, Lord Stannis," Aegon said, voice slightly strained from irritation. "My uncle has made that point clear to me since I was old enough to listen. But the Night's Watch is in shambles, and even half that number could well pose a threat. With a 700-foot-tall wall in their way," came the skeptical voice of Yohn Royce, the Valeman Master of Laws. "Yes, Lord Royce, even with a 700-foot wall in the way. We have a guest here who can attest to that fact. Yoren, take the rhetoric if you will." This voice was one Aemon had never heard, rough and northern. The second son of Aerys strained to hear his drawl clearly. "Thank you, Your Grace. I myself don't see near what some of my brothers do. I've been a recruiter for the Watch for near 30 years, ever since a wilding axe took away my ability to fight well. But I know that the Watch doesn't have enough mean to defend the Watch proper, and the wildlings have found ways to get round it. Pray tell, how do unwashed barbarians bypass the wall?" Lord Royce's voice was dripping with contempt. His family had battled the mountain tribes of the Vale, often called wildlings themselves, for countless generations. Bronze Yohn was a good man, but hatred could sway a man's mind from reason and even civility. Aemon's father was a sterling example of that. Many ways. They can take canoes from Hardhome and land behind it. They can't get across in large numbers that way before we find out, but they could land enough to attack the remaining men of the Watch. That, and they can climb it. "Climb it," spoke the surprised voice of Lord Tyrion. "Now that is a feat worth respecting, no matter if it is our enemies doing it." "Yes, Lord, spikes and ropes. Plenty of them die in the attempt, but plenty more live." Randyll Tarly piped in. "Can they mass under the Watch's nose that way?" "No. But the Watch numbers less than 1,000 men now, and those are spread out across the few forts we still have manned. All the bastards need to do is get enough behind us to take Castle Black and then let the others come pouring through." Aegon spoke again. "As I'm sure my lords remember, the Watch has been forbidden from having defenses south of the wall ever since the defeat of the Night's King." That name sent shivers down Aemon's spine. If the Watch falls, nothing stands between them and the mainland of all of Westeros. If their numbers are even near what reports have them to be, they are a threat beyond anything we have faced in 100 years. Aegon's voice became more commanding, more kingly. "I intend to gather a force and go to the aid of the Night's Watch. If this threat is nothing, so be it. But I do not intend to risk the lives of innocent small folk because I refuse to heed warnings from a man we all agree to be highly competent." Aelor spoke for the first time then, his father's cool baritone easily heard and commanding of respect. "We all know the other fear of this mentioned in reports, the one none of us want to believe. I'm not saying it is viable and I'm not saying I support it, but I have learned it is impossible to be overly cautious in this savage bitch of a life. King Aegon has my full support in this, and I volunteer the veterans and levies of Duskendale to march north under the king's command." Aemon could hear the thanks in his cousin the king's voice. Aegon had ruled well in his short stint after the regency, but all knew the Dragon of Duskendale was still the true power in the Seven Kingdoms, no matter that Aelor didn't want to be. It bothered Aegon plainly, but the king knew perfectly well that a pledge of full support from the warrior prince, especially if he pledged his men to serve under Aegon instead of himself, would sway the minds of the others. "I accept it, uncle." A pause as Aegon likely turned to face another, although Aemon obviously couldn't see from the dark niche he was in. "Lord Tarly, I understand you have chief control of the army in times of war, but I will lead this expedition myself. I invite you along as an advisor." Tarly's response was immediate and neutral. Tarly was grim and unforgiving, but he had a knack for handling himself well in political situations. "Of course, your grace, uncle. I request you serve as regent while I am gone." "I refuse." The silence was total for a long moment. This time Aegon's voice was cold. "Say again, uncle." Aelor's own voice was calm and confident. "I am going with you. I am in command of this." You have full command of the army, including my own levies and retinue. I will defer to your orders in all things, as is my duty. But I am the strongest sword outside of the Kingsguard that you command, and I have more experience in bloodletting than any other man in Westeros outside of Sir Barristan. The wildlings are known for their savagery. We need some of our own. There was more silence, and Aemon could only presume his father and cousin were having a battle of wills. Aegon broke first. "Very well." His tone promised retribution. Aelor knew perfectly well that Aegon sought to escape his shadow in the north, and he was still potentially going to take that form him. Aegon wouldn't forget it. But then again, the Dragon of Duskendale would know that perfectly well also. Aegon's first blow came instantly. "Lord Tyrion, you will serve as regent in my stead." Aemon raised his eyebrows. Leaving a Lannister, even one Aelor had spared and out in power, in charge of the Dragon of Duskendale's city of birth, was a cutting move. Aemon supposed the king was trying to reassert his command over his uncles. He just hoped this enmity didn't increase. "Of course, your grace, the halfman is at your service." There were a few more negotiations between the council when they would leave, what forces in addition to the men of Duskendale would accompany the king, what Kingsguard would remain behind to protect the remaining members of the royal family. That Aemon only half listened to, though he was pleased to hear no more hostility between Aegon and Aelor, at least for now. His mind was racing with the excitement of the expedition north. The sensible side of him hoped it was nothing more than rumors, that there was no true threat of wildlings or anything much more dangerous. But the side of Aemon that longed for adventure despite his bookish nature disagreed. And in that moment, Aemon Targaryen decided he just had to see this for himself. He found his father at the door of the balcony the Dragon of Duskendale had always loved, looking out over the city he had saved 16 years earlier. It was raining still, the air having taken a chill of late. Aemon supposed the Starks would say winter is coming, the house words they seemed so adamant about, but no white raven had arrived from the citadel confirming that fact. Still, the second son of Aelor had been raised in a near-endless summer, and he could tell there was certainly something different in the air. His father heard him before he even had a chance to speak, turning to look at him. "Aemon," he greeted, smiling, towering over his son. Aemon had taken after his mother in all regards except his violet eyes, his frame average of shoulder and height, contrasting his father's impressive height and burly form. Aemon was still a few moons shy of 15, meaning he still had a chance to grow more into his father's build, but he doubted it would be the case. Not that he minded. Large people demanded attention by virtue of being bigger than others and thusly instantly noticeable. Average people, however, could bend in, and that is all Aemon wanted. "Father," he returned, voice quieter than his sire's, "I have a confession to make." Aelor grinned knowingly, taking his son by surprise with his next words. "I wondered if you would admit to listening in on the council." Barristan bet you would keep your silence. Calmer adamantly disagreed. It seems the Grandmeister was correct. Aemon was shocked and embarrassed for a moment, wondering how the hand of the king had known before the truth dawned on him. "Varys," he breathed, face ashen. "The little birds." Aelor had something of a twinkle in his eye as he grinned. "They sing in the east, they sing in the west, and they sing right in the middle." Aemon bowed his head, though he knew Aelor wasn't angry. "I apologize for the subterfuge, father, but I was too curious to resist." Aelor waved it away. "Nonsense, son, join me." The Dragon of Duskendale returned to leaning against the doorpost of the entry to the balcony, watching the rain fall. Aemon took the other side, looking out over the bustling and sprawling behemoth of a city. One could still see the aftermath of the Lannister raid in Flea Bottom, scorch marks on some of the buildings that had survived. The pile of burnt wood and charred bone of the funeral pyre had been cleaned out before Aemon had even been born. New buildings built in place of most of the old ones, but there were still open lots of blackened ground where the heat of the fires had burned away the life underneath. I imagine you have come to discuss the council. Yes, father. What are your thoughts? Aemon didn't hesitate. I am glad the king is taking the threat of the wildlings seriously, though I wonder if he should perhaps have taken the other threats seriously as well. His father turned his head to look at him, raising an eyebrow. You mean the others? When Aemon nodded, Aelor grunted. It is a hard story to believe, myths and bedtime stories meant to frighten children. Still, there is more to this world than swords and quills. I wonder if we should not be more concerned as well. I have read the stories of the battle for Dawn more times than I can count. It by all means sounds like a terrible, horrifying time, yet I can't help but wish, he trailed off. Not willing to put this irrational hope into words. His father was a supportive man, having accepted Aemon's scholarly disposition in a way Randall Tarly had never been able to accept his heir Samwell's, but he knew the whole notion to be ludicrous. Except apparently it wasn't. You wish it were true so you could witness it yourself. Aemon glanced at his father sheepishly, the dragon of Duskendale reaching a large hand out to pat his son's shoulder. I know the feeling. Before the Kingswood Brotherhood and Robert's Rebellion, I wanted nothing more than a war to prove myself. It is the nature of young men who haven't seen the true thing. Renfred and I were much like your cousin Aemon and brother Renlar are now, chomping at the bit to win the glories of battle. His father grunted again. Such fools we were, but we weren't the first, and we certainly won't be the last. I once heard Sir Barristan tell Ren that war is nothing like the stories, that young men wish for it until the day they first see it, and then they wonder why they wished for it at all. Aelor nodded sagely. That's about the truth of it. Bards make it sound like a glorious, honorable thing, but war is anything but. Aemon hesitated a moment before plunging forward with his request. I would like to find out. His father stood up abruptly. Taken aback by the statement, I wish to go north with you and Aegon. Aelor turned to face him fully, face confused. You've never had an interest in war before, Aemon. The son mimicked the move of the father, facing one another fully. And I don't now, but I have always wanted to see the wall, to experience for myself the beauty of the north. And if there are truly others and giant and who knows what else marching to destroy humanity, I would never forgive myself for being too cowardly to see them for myself before they are either stopped or they succeed. Aelor's face grew stern. Never call yourself a coward again, Aemon. The fact that you are willing to travel north with a war party when you want nothing to do with war is in itself evidence to the contrary. I am no warrior, father, but I am skilled at managing anything I put my mind to, and we know it. Make me a quartermaster or a scribe, whatever it is you need. Just allow me to travel with you and see the truth or falsehood of these rumors with my own eyes. The dragon of Duskendale was watching him, face now serious. You do know that if there truly is a threat, there will be battle, and however unlikely it is, there is a chance we will not emerge the victors. The enemy will not care if you're warrior or a whipping boy, they'll kill you just the same. It is the nature of men and war. Aemon nodded. I know, and I will not lie to you and say I am terrified of that possibility, but I need to do this, father. I love books and I am uncomfortable around people. But I know that a life spent dreaming of things I never allow myself to see is a life wasted. Aelor regarded his son for a long while, face unmoving. Aemon waited with bated breath, eyes pleading. Finally his father let out a long sigh. Very well, you may join us. Aemon's heart soared and he began to thank his father profusely, but the dragon of Duskendale brought his hand up firmly to stop the gratitude cold. On one condition. You have to be the one to explain this to your mother. The excitement fled instantly. Her husband was in his armor again. Alysanne Targaryen had only seen Aelor wear the black plate with its warring dragons twice since the end of Robert's Rebellion, and neither time had she been happy about it. The first was when he had ridden to the Stormlands to extinguish the line of House Rogers, burning their castle and lands as he had Lannisport all those years ago. The second had been more recently, when Corlys Roxton had nearly raised his flag in doomed revolt. Both times she had been terrified to see her husband ride away, not knowing if he would ever return to her and their children. Whether or not Aelor loved her as much as he had the long-dead Elia Mardell was a question even Alysanne didn't know the answer to, but it hadn't stopped her from loving him as much as a body could. This was the third time she was to watch him ride away, and that feeling of dread was as present as ever. Warrior, on the other hand, was nearly giddy. The massive black stallion sensed that the mass of horses and men scurrying to and fro in the stables and courtyard of the Red Keep was a war party, and he was acting like a horse a quarter of his age, excitedly bellowing his war cry of a neigh and nearly prancing around the post he was tied to. The stallion was 20 years old, Not ancient for a horse, but certainly older than any other animal being geared up for war. Alysanne had questioned Aelor's decision to ride the old destrier to the potential battles up north, and not one of his many descendants. There were well over a dozen black-hided stallions in the courtyard that had been sired by the famous horse. As vicious as he had been in his youth and as attached as Aelor was to the aptly named beast, he'd ridden the horse everywhere since the war. Although destriers were bred for battle and didn't have the smooth gait most looked for in a horse for everyday riding, she wondered if her husband shouldn't take a younger animal. Aelor had cut the head off of the idea instantly. He swore upon the emerald dagger he had killed Robert Baratheon with that warrior was more man than horse, and that there had never been a smarter animal or an animal more suited to war than the old stallion. In her many years around the beast, she couldn't deny the former. Her husband was saying his goodbyes to Rhaella, Sarah, and Daenerys. Most of the knights swarming the courtyard in preparation for riding out were in travel clothing. If there was to be a battle, it would be weeks away, and they saw no reason to subject themselves to the discomfort of wearing armor when there was zero chance of battle. Even King Aegon wore a doublet and cloak of black and crimson, not the ornate and expensive armor he owned. Aelor, however, was in full plate, the same suit he had worn in those fierce battles of the rebellion. Alysanne had learned that when Aelor donned the armor, he donned the mindset of war. Whenever he was riding towards a fight, guaranteed or just potential, he wore his armor almost exclusively. Alysanne watched with tears threatening to fall. This time was not like the other times her husband had ridden out to war. Both of those times his victory was all but guaranteed, and while it was likely this one was no different, there was certainly an undercurrent of what if. And the true reason behind her discomfort was that he was taking 4 of her sons with him. Her eldest Ren sat his stallion beside the king, who was her child in all but blood. They were talking giddily, excited by the prospect of war in the way Aelor told her only unbloodied boys could be. Aemon, her sweet, quiet Aemon, sat another horse behind them, face carefully blank. She had been surprised and terrified when her second son, the one meant to inherit her father's lands and her ancestral castle, had come to her professing her intent to ride north with the war party. Her second child was no warrior and never would be. Why in the 7 hells was he going to ride to war? She had been nearly hysterical in forbidding him, but her son had shown the steely resolve few knew he possessed in insisting he was going along with or without her blessing. It had taken, and still was taking, everything she had to prevent herself from begging him further to remain in King's Landing with her. She supposed it was hypocritical of her to protest Aemon not go when she was allowing 2 of his full brothers to, especially when one of them was younger than him. Alysanne hadn't been surprised when Aelor broke it to her that Balon was riding along. He was, after all, her husband's squire, though only recently having turned 2 and 10. Her third son belonged with a war party. He was quieter than even Aemon and twice as grim, so silent that Alysanne had once wondered if he was a simpleton. She'd learned later that he was anything but. Balon was brilliant, at least in terms of strategy and swordplay, but he was also eccentric and dangerous. He was Aelor incarnate, though clearly more Ares than the dragon of Duskendale and perhaps even Viserys. Alysanne spent long nights praying to the 7 that her son not be a second coming of the Mad King. But so far they had given her no sign dissuading her that he was. She couldn't help but love him, however, no matter his potential to become a monster. She'd grown used to loving dangerous men with the potential for unprecedented violence. One of those men came to a stop in front of her, resplendent in the black plate that fit him so well. His helm with its white flame crest was tucked under his arm, as scarred as his face from the blade of a long-dead Lannister. Aelor bent down to place a kiss on Alyssa's head, the babe somehow sleeping despite the cacophony of noise coming from the horses and men in the courtyard. "Promise me, Aelor," Alysanne whispered as she pulled her husband into the side that wasn't supporting her youngest, gripping his black plate fiercely as he wrapped his armored-free arm around her small frame. "Promise me you will bring our sons back to us." He held her close for a long moment, running a gauntlet through her dark hair, before leaning back and placing a long kiss to her lips. "I promise," his comforting to her at least, voice reassured when he leaned back, grinning. It was an empty promise, one they both knew he couldn't guarantee to keep, but it was enough for now. Alysanne Lefford watched as he strode to and swung up on the massive stallion, warrior impatiently pawing the ground in his desire to get to the rush of battle both horse and rider so loved. She watched as he rode to join her sons, and 2 knights of the Kingsguard at the head of the column, Balon close behind, each Targaryen mounted upon a stallion as black as their banners. She watched as Aegon ordered the column forward, to meet with the men of Duskendale under Donal Buckwell at the castle of House Byitch, and the men under Lord Wen of Harrenhal at that cavernous ruin of a castle. And when the last horse disappeared out of the courtyard of the Red Keep, Alysanne Lefford wept. King Viserys Targaryen, third of his name, king of the Andals and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm. It had one hell of a ring to it. Viserys slipped out from between the two camp followers he'd taken to his bed a week earlier, both of Lyseni blood with light blonde hair and purple eyes. One's hair was a shade too dark and the other's shorn too short, and their eyes were much more indigo than violet. But if Viserys didn't look at their faces too much and he repeatedly told his mind they were, he could just convince himself they were what his heart desired above all else. It was like having two Daenerys at the same time. Viserys would trade both fakes for the real one in a heartbeat, but he'd take what he could get for now. Both, Viserys was fairly certain their names were Solara and Leela's. Though he didn't truly give much of a damn, grumbled and twisted slightly in the massive bed, but neither one woke. Viserys yawned as he stretched, joints popping, and then set to dressing in the expensive silk and cloth of gold, a golden three-headed dragon stitched across the chest of his doublet. He strapped his sword to his side and then with great care placed the crown of gold, emeralds and rubies atop his head. Relishing its weight and the feeling of power it flooded into his veins. Straightening his spine, he flung aside the tense flap and stepped out into the harsh sunshine. They were camped somewhere along the western Essosi coastline, north of the free city of Myr and south of Pentos. Viserys had grumbled when he'd first arrived at the staging area, even in his wretched exile used to at least some level of comfort, but the commanders of the Golden Company had convinced him of their reasoning. Viserys knew as well as anyone that the spider had little birds everywhere. They sang just as loud in the east as they did in the west. While it was unlikely Viserys' new affiliation with the Golden Company would stay a secret from Varys for long, any amount of delay in its revelation would be to their advantage. Camping in this middle of nowhere, away from the thousands of prying eyes in the free cities, would only help in that endeavor. Alester Strong instantly appeared at his side. 8 and 10, the squire was thick of neck and arm, short but savagely powerful. He wasn't the quickest of mind to be sure, but despite his relative youth he was an experienced killer who doubled as Viserys' squire and bodyguard. Viserys had yet to select his own Kingsguard. As much as he hated his brother, the Prince of Summerhall had learned from the Dragon of Duskendale to choose those closest to him carefully, but he felt protected enough with Alester for now. Besides, they were in the middle of 10,000 warriors all serving him. Alester's father, Duncan Strong, was one of the company's sergeants, his arms covered in gold rings signifying over 20 years of service. While the mercenary father and son were of Westerosi heritage, Viserys doubted they were truly descended from the long-extinct House Strong of the Riverlands, former lords of Harrenhal. A man of the Golden Company could call himself whatever he wished, and there was another sergeant with no blood relation to Duncan, a brute of a man named Daenerys, who styled himself a Strong as well. It didn't truly matter though. When he took the Iron Throne from his cursed nephew and executed the traitorous lords who served him, he would give Duncan and Daenerys Harrenhal and its subsequent lands back, though how they would split it between them wasn't his concern. That was his deal with the Golden Company. 10,000 men, bloodied killers all, would help him take the kingdoms of his father. In return, he would grant the conquered lands to the men of the Golden Company. Many were actual exiles who yearned for their ancestral seats. Laswell Peake and his brothers, Captain General Harry Strickland, Franklin Flowers the bastard of Cider Hall, supposedly Duncan and Daenerys Strong. Others, Will Cole, John Mudd, Melo Jane, didn't even pretend to have a claim, some like Jane not even of Westerosi blood. They too would be granted lordships, however, assuming the positions that Viserys would empty. Theirs would be right of conquest instead of right of blood. This was the world Viserys intended to build, Daenerys at his side. News had arrived during the night, something major judging by the flurry of activities the camp had undergone. Viserys was rather vexed that nothing had been said to him, their king, but he would withhold his displeasure for the time being. The council they had called this morning was sure to fill in the blanks for him, and in the process he would get a further idea of who was truly in command for now. Viserys wasn't a fool. He knew the only reason these men had first agreed to follow him was their hopes of returning home or becoming rich, not because they found him to be their true king. As such, they would only follow his commands to a point. It was true that Viserys wasn't the true king. He wasn't even very high in the succession anymore, thanks to Alysanne Lefford and her talent at getting pregnant and birthing boys. He needed to bide his time, see where the true power of the company lay, and then go about taking it for himself. Viserys hated Aelor, but his brother had taught him well. The council was already underway even as Viserys entered, only a few of the veteran mercenaries bothering to rise and bow to Viserys before the king took his place at the head of the table. It was a lack of respect they would all pay dearly for, though not quite yet. homeless Harry Strickland. Portly and the exact opposite of what one would expect a mercenary to look like, was talking. While he still hadn't figured out the true power structure behind the Golden Company, Viserys was nearly certain that it didn't lie with Harry Strickland, no matter the man's position as Captain General. The great-grandson of a former Lord of the Reach was somewhat craven, a belief given credence by the words the man was saying right now. We do not have the numbers. Even with the elephants, we are hopelessly outmatched. Jon Lothston, another man under the guise of a supposedly extinct bloodline, viciously countered. One of the Sergeants Viserys had noticed the red-haired sellsword was the biggest of Strickland's rivals, constantly infuriated by the Captain General's cowardice. Their strongest fighters are moving north as we speak, leaving their heartland undefended. Now is the time to strike. Duncan Strong seemed to be the normal voice of reason of the council, and he continued that role now. They still have many times again as many men as we do in the south, even with the allies we have in place. There is only so much havoc we could wreak. Lothston world, scattered men, easy for the picking. We can turn Aelor Targaryen's own tactic against him, pick the enemy off piecemeal before they can unite. It nearly ended Robert Baratheon's rebellion before it truly began, if you recall. Lothston eyed Strickland once more. We cannot sit here in Essos like cowards and let this opportunity pass. Peace, Lothston, barked the rough voice of Maelo Jane, his accent that of the Far East. The lean man turned to face Viserys, bowing ever so slightly. The king needs to be brought up to date. That is precisely why you will receive a high lordship, my friend, the Westerlands should do. Viserys eyed them all coolly, a tactic he had seen his brother use to great effect. The meeting should not have begun without me, Master Jane. But I am willing to overlook it this time in light of what I gather to be good news to our cause. None of the hardened mercenaries apart from Strickland looked chagrined, but Viserys knew he had yet to win their respect or their fear. It would all come in due time. Lysono Mar, spymaster of the company, filled the king in. The Lyseni, with his lilac eyes and his pierced ears decorated with amethysts and pearls, looked more like a woman than a man. But he had a vast array of contacts and spies nearly everywhere, including Westeros, the population of which seemed to be 25% spies in Viserys' mind. His network was not as vast as Varys, of course, but enough to keep the company very well informed. Your nephew and brother are leading a force of men to the wall to deal with an apparent wildling threat. Half of the power of the North will join them there. Lothston spoke again, voice excited at the prospect of finally beginning the invasion this company was founded to undertake. King's Landing is relatively undefended, with only a few household guardsmen to defend her. We can strike now and take it, capturing many of your kinsmen to hold as leverage as well as freeing the future queen. Viserys instantly liked Lothston 1,000 times more than before when he referred to Daenerys as the future queen, but it didn't stop his skepticism. Between Dragonstone and King's Landing, my cursed nephew has one of the strongest fleets in the known world. All the war elephants and experienced infantrymen in the world will do no good if we cannot land. Strickland apparently agreed. My point exactly. Mar, however, wasn't finished, shooting the king a smirk that made Viserys want to smash his feminine face in. Our friends in Westeros have plans to remove that threat, at least long enough for our own ships to make landfall. The Prince of Summerhall waited for clarification the spymaster did not give. Explain. Viserys demanded as calmly as he could. Jane obliged. Your nephew has taken the levies of Duskendale as well as most of his personal retinue north with him, meaning the most experienced and disciplined fighters for the Iron Throne will be a world away from us when we land. Most important of all, however, is that your brother is with them. He is the glue that holds your nephew's kingship together, and with him too far to harm them, well, there are several powerful figures in Westeros who have no love for the Dragon of Duskendale. Mar took the rhetoric. Your brother ruled ably and most of Westeros will remain loyal, it is true, but there is no small number of lords who have not forgotten or forgiven the atrocities he has committed. They question whether he is truly sane. Viserys missed the glance several members of the council shared at that, too focused on the task at hand as Lysono continued. We have been in contact with these lords since the day we learned Aegon exiled you, your grace. We have support to overthrow the Dragon of Duskendale. My nephew is king, not my uncle. Duncan Strong smiled. There are many who would contest that point, your grace. When these men hear Aegon VI, they truly think Aelor I. Mar nodded. With the Dragon of Duskendale too far to be an immediate threat, we can strike hard and fast with the lords who ally with us, destroying the armies in the south one at a time while Aegon and Aelor fight unwashed barbarians in the far north. Viserys' heart was pounding at the possibility. Though he would never admit it to any of these men, he was terrified of his older brother and had spent all of his life trying to avoid Aelor's retribution. But with said brother so far away, unable to strike back at Viserys, he could feasibly take all he wanted in one fell swoop. If he captured Alysanne and the children, he would have a bargaining chip keeping his brother at bay. But all of that depended on the Golden Company landing and successfully taking King's Landing. And that depended on a lack of a royal navy in their way, which these mercenaries still hadn't explained how they were going to accomplish. Viserys leaned back in his chair at the head of the table. This tells me nothing of how we won't have a navy in our way. Black Balak, the white-haired, soot-skinned commander of the Golden Company archers, spoke for the first time, voice deep and resonant. Your brother destroyed Tywin Lannister without the royal navy because he had a substitute force. We shall destroy him in turn with that same one. Viserys' eyes opened wide in revelation. The Ironborn. There was a chorus of nods, though Jane was the one to speak. Yes, your grace. Their numbers were barely touched during the last war, and Balon Greyjoy is nothing like his father Quellin. He has chafed under the rule of your brother, but he has had no opportunity to rise in rebellion. Until now. He intends to start raiding the western coast, pillaging castles and their armies and driving the Iron Throne to react. The Red Wine Fleet cannot handle the might of the Iron Fleet by itself, so the regent of the crown, Tyrion Lannister, a less than respected dwarf as luck would have it, will order much of the royal navy to assist them. Viserys cocked a brow. They will also muster their army, which defeats our purpose of attacking them piecemeal. Balak bowed his head in deference. A wise point, your grace, but the Golden Company will strike before these armies grow too strong. And with the crown split between two enemies, they will be overmatched and destroyed. Viserys ran the merits and intricacies of the plan through his head. He wasn't a gifted tactician like Aelor or Aegon, but he had learned much during the lessons he had so detested as a boy. The plan relied on massive amounts of ifs and hopes, but the potential could not be denied. This might be his only true chance to take both what was his by birthright, Dany, but also what he had thirsted after since he was a teen. Viserys' heart pounded ever harder as his hopes soared. This is my opportunity. This is where I will make my name. There was only one catch. What does Balon Greyjoy want in return? This time Viserys didn't miss the look shared by the council, and he knew at once that he wouldn't like whatever it was Balon Greyjoy was demanding. Lothston was the one to break the news to him. He wants independence for the Iron Islands. Viserys jumped to his feet, slamming a fist on the table. None of the mercenaries flinched, infuriating Viserys the more. When he'd seen Aelor do the same action, half of the lords nearly pissed themselves. Absolutely not. I am the king of 7 kingdoms, not 6. Jane spoke in a soothing tone. Viserys sounded annoying, though he tried to hold that anger in check this time. Your grace, we agree that his demands are atrocious, but once he helps you capture your throne, nothing says we have to let him keep that independence. Harry Strickland may have been captain general, but he had been deemed nearly non-existent to this point. It truly shows that he is not where the power lies. We are the Golden Company, we cannot go back on our word. His voice was appalled, as if Jane had spoken blasphemy. We will not go back on our word as the Golden Company, Mar said, voice slightly annoyed. But once we have taken King Viserys' throne, the Golden Company will be no more. Westeros nobility have no qualms with betraying one another. If that is what we are to be, we should not either. The Iron Islands will have no chance to stand against the other kingdoms once they are united solidly under King Viserys' rule. Strickland opened his mouth to protest again, but no words came forth. Viserys' mind raced, weighing the options. This was his chance. This is where he could finally take his heart's desire. Viserys rose, trying for all the world to look kingly. We will not get a better opportunity. Let us go to war, gentlemen. For the first time since Viserys had come in contact with the Golden Company, each man bowed. Aegon Targaryen had never been so cold in his entire life. The wall was a splendor to behold, so massive it made even a king wonder how man had made such a thing, but it was 700 feet of ice. Aegon was of the south. He didn't like ice, or snow, or the wind so cold it could cut through layer upon layer of fur and leather, freezing his pale skin. Targaryens were dragons, not bloody snow bears. They thrived in heat and flame, not chill and snowflake. Except Jaehaerys, of course. His half-brother seemed right at home, surrounded by Starks and a red-eyed, white-furred beast of a direwolf. The king couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at how well the animal's fur matched the white armor of Sir Boren of the Kingsguard, who had traveled north with Jaehaerys over half a year ago. Aegon supposed it was the Stark that ran through Jaehaerys' veins that gave him his cold resistance, the blood of 6,000 years' worth of kings of winter flowing through the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. Aegon was buggered in that regard. On one side he was a dragon, on the other the bloody sun itself. Neither lent much help in being prepared for the north. Even the cold and the terrifying-looking direwolf couldn't stop the king from swinging off his black stallion and striding to the black-haired prince, even as the courtyard, Stark, Targaryen and Crow alike, sank to one knee. With a chuckle he waved Jaehaerys up before clasping his brother's wrist, slapping Jaehaerys' shoulder. "You look like shit, baby brother." Jaehaerys grinned at that. "You'd best be careful, your grace," he said, tilting his head towards the albino direwolf regarding the king quizzically. "He's somewhat protective of me." Aegon raised an eyebrow at the beast, trying to keep his face blank of the apprehension standing near the creature gave him. Its red eyes bored into his violet ones, more intelligence behind them than any animal had a right to possess. Though his slightly too big legs and ears indicated the wolf still had some growing to do, he was already bigger than any dog Aegon had come in contact with before. "So this is the infamous ghost, eh? He's big." Jaehaerys laughed at that, grinning. "You should see Grey Wind, Robb's wolf, makes Ghost here look like a runt." Aegon had the suspicion that he in fact did not want to see Grey Wind, though the mention of Robb Stark reminded the King of the Iron Throne that there were others present awaiting his word. "Lord Stark, it is a pleasure to see you again." The Lord of Winterfell rose, the others in the courtyard doing the same as Aegon's own party began dismounting. "It is an honor, your grace," Eddard replied, ice the stark greatsword of Valyrian steel strapped across the layers of furs covering his back. A young man beside him grinned even as the king and Lord Paramount spoke. Aegon turned to meet that grin with one of his own, grasping the wrist of the heir to the north as he had Jaehaerys moments before. "Robb, it is good to see you again. And you, your grace." His blue eyes lit up with glee. "I would have loved for Grey Wind to greet you as well, but I'm afraid he became distracted with a particularly juicy bone. I've not been able to teach him proper priorities as of yet." Aegon shook his head in wry amusement as he moved on down the line to a stocky, broad-shouldered man in a black cloak. "Lord Commander Mormont, I presume." The Night's Watchman's voice was as grizzled and rough as his aged face. "An honor, your grace. The Night's Watch is indebted to you for answering our call." Aegon shook his head. "It is my duty as King, Mormont, though I will not lie and claim that my decision to turn north was deemed wise by all those at court." Another voice, elderly and wizened, responded from the ranks of crows. "Those at court have not seen what we here at the wall have, your grace." An ancient man, face lined with more wrinkles than Aegon had coined, slowly walked forward, escorted by none other than Samwell Tarly, who had attached himself to Jaehaerys' party when the prince first went north. To escape his father, no doubt, who ridiculed Sam but was unable to replace him as heir to Hornhill due to Samwell's friendship with Jaehaerys. The elderly man's hair was as white as the snow around them, stature stooped from age, eyes milky and clearly blind. What most of us here on the wall have seen, that is. Aegon shouldered past Mormont and Robb, taking the hand of the oldest living Targaryen. "Maester Aemon," the king breathed, unable to move as his great-great-uncle's hand slowly reached up to brush over Aegon's face, as if the blind former prince was seeing with his hands. Aegon realized with a start that he was. "I have heard many good things about you, Aegon Targaryen. I believe you would have made Egg more than proud." Aegon didn't have time to question just who Egg was before another presence appeared on the Maester's other side. A gauntleted hand reaching out to replace Samwell Tarly's gentle grip on Aemon's arm. "Uncle Aemon," Aelor nearly whispered, a direct contrast to the authoritative tone the dragon of Duskendale normally wielded as a weapon. Aegon knew these two men, who had at one time been the only adult Targaryens left in all the world, had kept a correspondence since before Aegon had even been born. Meaning this meeting had a much more potent effect on Aelor than it was having on Aegon. "I'm glad I can finally put a face to the name." The old Aemon repeated the face tracing on Aelor even as he smiled knowingly. "I wish I could say the same, nephew." Aelor returned the smile even though the Maester couldn't see it, appropriately chagrined by the faux pas in word selection. "I have several of my sons with me, uncle, one of whom is named after you." He was nearly as excited at the prospect of this meeting as I was. Meeting another Aemon Targaryen would be a pleasure. For a time I wondered if there would be any of my blood left to bear the name. But my bones are old and the cold bothers me. I would prefer to meet my great-great-nephews in the warmth of Castle Black. Aegon and Aelor both laughed near identical sounds. "Of course, uncle," Aegon said, turning to Lord Commander Mormont and Lord Stark, both of whom had been waiting respectfully. "I suspect there is much to be discussed, my lords." Mormont nodded sharply. "Aye, your grace, much and more." Tyrion Lannister had often said he intended to travel north, climb the wall and piss off of the edge of the world. Since the entertaining and brutally smart Lord of the Westerlands was stuck back in King's Landing, Aegon Targaryen did the honors for him, no matter how unkingly the action was. The view from 700 feet in the air was unlike any other the King of the Iron Throne had seen before, particularly here at dusk. The setting sun painted the sky in oranges and reds, making the savage land north of the wall look almost serene. Aegon looked out across the forest and icy mountains and wondered how something so beautiful could produce something as brutal as the wildlings. And just maybe, things much more deadly. Reading of tales and reports from beyond the wall, past to King's Landing in the scrawl of Commander Mormont, was one thing. Hearing those same tales from the men who had lived the experiences was another. Aegon didn't necessarily believe the tales of giants and others, not even after the first-hand accounts of some of the Watch's most reliable men, but he couldn't quite say he disbelieved them either. The sheer terror in the eyes of some of the Rangers, men who were in normal circumstances every bit as tough as even Aelor, could not be faked. None could say they had seen a White Walker themselves, though no one was truly sure just what those even looked like, but they had most certainly seen something, and whatever it was had frightened them. That in turn frightened Aegon. He wasn't a craven, but he certainly wasn't a fool either. The Royal Relief Force had arrived a few hours after dawn, and after a midday meal a council had been convened. It had lasted until mere moments ago, Night's Watchmen, Northmen and Southerners all debating the best way to handle the wildling threat, which was the foremost issue on most minds despite the underlying, sinister threat. Reports consistently placed Mance raiders in the tens and tens of thousands, numbers nearly unfathomable to Aegon's mind, but estimates the Rangers swore to. Aegon had brought with him 15,000 men, the Starks another 10. The Watch itself numbered less than 1,000 with only a few hundred quality fighting men among them. Aegon had no idea just how bad the state of the Watch had become, and already was planning on rebuilding it back to strength. Assuming he survived, that is. On the trip north the idea that he hadn't even crossed the king's mind. The wildlings were supposedly unwashed, unorganized barbarians. While that may yet prove true, there seemed to be a whole hell of a lot of them. While the higher quality of men and weapons the Targaryen prince possessed evened the odds considerably, there was something to be said for sheer mass of numbers. Even so, with the wall as a buffer between his men and the swarming capabilities of the wildlings, the royalist had a startling advantage. But that also provided a problem. There were near 26,000 men on the Watch side of the wall, and while they had brought rations for their men as expected, Aegon couldn't camp out on the wall forever and eat through the supplies of the Night's Watch. As the Starks so often said, winter was coming. And even after the wildling and any other threat was put down, the Watch would have to do battle with the cold. But if he sallied forth north of the wall, he'd be giving the wildlings the advantage. They'd see him coming with so many men, and while his better soldiers could smash the wildlings in open field, there seemed to be a stunning lack of those north of the wall. If it became a war of attrition, Aegon knew he would come out on the losing side. Each of his best men were worth 10 wildlings, but all reports of Mance Raider claimed he was passing intelligent. The king beyond the wall would know not to engage Aegon fully and would take to the forests and hills, wearing out the horses and men of the King of the Iron Throne and bleeding Aegon slowly. Aegon's one true advantage was that Raider would have the same logistical problems. Some rumors placed his number of men at triple that of Aegon's, which meant triple the men to feed. A large number of women and children were also among the wildling camps, which provided their own set of issues. While Aegon couldn't stay at the wall forever, Mance Raider couldn't keep so many hungry mouths together on the other side of it either. Which led to the final issue. Nothing said Mance Raider would stay on the other side. The wall could stop an army, it was true. But it couldn't do much against one man. Small parties sailed across the Bay of Ice in canoes to land on the other side. Others reportedly even climbed it. While there was no chance of even near his entire force reaching the southern side of the wall, it was no secret that only Castle Black, Eastwatch by the Sea and the Shadow Tower were occupied. That left miles and miles of open territory where small bands could cross and begin to wreak havoc on the north and on the forces at the wall. Which is why most of his force was leaving in the morning. Beautiful, isn't it? Aegon turned to face the voice, tucking his manhood back into his breeches. Walking by the ever-vigilant Sir Barristan was his brother Jaehaerys, covered head to toe in black. Aegon nodded in greeting before turning back to the view. Aye, it is. I have spent nearly all of my time up here since we arrived. I can't get enough of it. You enjoy it here, don't you? Jaehaerys nodded. I enjoy the north, yes. Something about it seems to draw me in, take a hold of me. Like when Jaehaerys didn't continue, Aegon smiled gently, laying a hand on his shoulder. Like you belong here. The black-haired prince could only nod. Aegon chuckled lightly. I hope you don't start hating the South, brother, if I fall to wildlings or a giant or just the stupid cold weather. You are the king of the Iron Throne. Jaehaerys shoved Aegon jokingly. You will not fall, Aegon. Sir Barristan will not allow it, correct Barristan. The older but always deadly Kingsguard grinned. Correct, my prince. Jaehaerys turned back to the king. You see, you will come out of this as whole as you went in, mark my words. They chuckled together before growing silent, observing the rapidly setting sun as the already frigid temperatures dropped even more. After a long while Aegon spoke again, voice low. How is your mother? The question was simple enough at face value. But both Targaryens knew Aegon's true meaning in asking it. Jaehaerys sighed, long and slow. She loves me very much and I her. But, the half-Stark grunted, she missed so much of my life that she wants to be in every waking moment of it now. That was fantastic at first. I'd spent so long dreaming of meeting her that the actual thing was bliss. But it's like she does not realize I am every bit Targaryen as I am Stark. It is as if she wishes me to abandon the dragon for the wolf, and as if she doesn't realize that I need time to myself as well. Aegon nodded slowly, pursing his lips. So you're saying your mother can be annoying? Yes, though the Seven know she means well and I love her for it. It took all Eddard and I had to keep her in Winterfell and out of the war party. It's nice to be able to breathe again. Aegon only nodded, though a small smile played on the corner of his lip. Jaehaerys caught it, and though he threw his elder brother a glare, the same twitch began in his own lips. Before long, the two brothers were laughing aloud. When they sobered several moments later, Aegon asked the question he knew he probably shouldn't. I noticed you still aren't talking to our uncle. Jaehaerys' face instantly resorted to its grim nature. I don't know what to say. Aegon said nothing, allowing his brother time to gather his words. Down deep I understand why he did what he did, I truly do. I may not be happy about it, but if I were in his place I likely would have done the same. I'm not saying all he did was right because it certainly wasn't, but I wasn't correct in all of my actions either, particularly during the tourney at Duskendale. Gods, it's all just a mess. The king patted his brother on the shoulder once more. You should speak with him, settle the air. There are too few of us Targaryens in the world to allow infighting in our family. Even as Aegon said it, he felt ashamed. I am no one to talk on this matter. Me who despises his uncle's power. Before Jaehaerys could respond or Aegon could voice his own conflict, the strong voice from their youth spoke from behind them. Jaehaerys, both princes whirled to find Aelor Targaryen standing beside Barristan's scarred armor blending in with the rapidly falling night. His equally scarred face was impassive, but Aegon could see no small amount of relief in his uncle's violet eyes. It was all the king needed to see to know that he had heard at least the last part of their exchange. Jaehaerys opened his mouth to respond, but whatever words he had intended to say became lodged in his throat, for the prince didn't manage to make so much as a sound. That was all well and good it seemed, for Aelor spoke again quickly. I am taking my retinues and Renler and Balin ahead of my force to scout out the way to the night fort before we garrison it. Aelor hesitated. It was odd hearing the man who so decisively destroyed cities be at a loss for words. I was wondering if you would like to come along. Jaehaerys kept his silence for a long moment, Aegon knowing better than to say a word. His uncle had volunteered himself and his two warlike sons to garrison the night fort, the largest of the ruined and abandoned Night's Watch castles, and also the one with more legend of terror surrounding it than any other. Jaehaerys had been meant to accompany none other than accomplished ranger Jaime Lannister, the same Kingslayer Aelor had sentenced to take the Black all those years ago, to Queensgate, putting a fair amount of distance between Lannister and renowned Lannister slayer. But plans could be changed, and Aegon waited almost as apprehensively as he knew Aelor was. Yes, the younger prince said finally, nodding ever so slightly. I believe I will, uncle. The dragon of Duskendale nodded, smiled ever so slightly and quietly turned to leave. Well, that's one battle over. Now all we have left is 80,000 wildlings and mythical ice demons. This should be a piece of lemon cake. Jaehaerys had been raised with stories of his uncle's valor on the battlefield, of the marvelous feats the famed dragon of Duskendale had carried out. Even as he heard those stories from the court, his uncle had refuted them, claiming war was nothing like those stories led boys to believe, and that Aelor himself was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. The prince realized now that his uncle had been correct on both accounts. Their scouting force had encountered a raiding party of wildlings just outside the Night Fort's walls, proving the decision to garrison and patrol the ruined castles a good one. The wildlings had been as surprised by the sudden arrival of 4 Targaryen princes and their retinue as the Targaryen princes had been at the presence of the wildlings. The two sides were evenly matched in number, though there were several thousand Targaryen and Night's Watch soldiers rapidly closing in on the skirmish, and it seemed to crash into one another in a mutual decision to kill. Jaehaerys had never seen battle before, but he had drawn his sword and charged in alongside his uncle and Sir Boren without hesitation. He hadn't even had a chance to think about it. He heard the War of Warrior, his uncle's old warhorse, and found the stallion he himself rode, one of Warrior's many descendants echoing the cry. Or maybe that Jaehaerys himself, he couldn't quite say. All that mattered was the sword in his hand. His shield was strapped to his stallion's back. They hadn't actually been expecting any sort of battle, but Jaehaerys had wisely followed his uncle's lead and donned his black armor. His personal sigil of the warring dragon and wolf, newly etched onto his breastplate, gleamed as his stallion barreled towards a huge wildling with a massive gray beard. They were all afoot, dressed in boiled leather and many furs against mounted men in armor, but the wildlings joined the battle with a war cry of their own. Jaehaerys catapulted towards the big wildling from the side, as the big man was distracted by 2 men of the Night's Watch, scouts that had shown Aelor the way to the Night Fort. Jaehaerys readied his blade, intending to skewer the wildling from the side with no regards to if it was an honorable blow. The giant wildling cut down one of Watchmen as Jaehaerys grew ever closer, turning to rain down blows on the other with stunning ferocity. The move placed his back more firmly in Jaehaerys' path, however, and the prince readied himself to land the blow. But suddenly an arrow sprouted from the eye-hole in his stallion's armor, digging deep and killing his horse instantly, and Jaehaerys found himself flung forward as the great destrier crashed to the ground. Before the prince understood what was happening, he was flat on his back, ears ringing and visor angled up to block his vision, sword miraculously still in his hand. His vision swam for a moment, left hand reaching up to pull his visor back down without any true conscious thought. And suddenly, instead of looking at his visor, he was looking at a sword, rusty but certainly sharp, stabbing straight down towards his face. Instinct took over. The countless hours Jaehaerys had spent training in the tilt yard, all that saved his life. He twisted his head out of the way, the sword that was supposed to sink into his eye instead digging into the churned snow. In the same instant, Jaehaerys drove his blade up, his mind calculating where the wildling who was attempting to kill him was without any effort on the prince's own behalf. He felt the blade dig into something solid, felt something flow into the gap between his gauntlet and vambrance, and he rose to a sitting position out of instinct, driving the blade deeper. A wildling stood halfway over him, surprise across his features as his lifeblood trailed in rivulets over Jaehaerys' arm. Even as he struggled all the way to his feet in his armor, withdrawing his sword from the now dead wildling, Jaehaerys knew he'd never forget the man's face. Jaehaerys didn't dwell on it long, though part of his brain knew he would relive the moment in his brain over and over in his dreams that night. The sound of battle still raged around him, Jaehaerys catching a glimpse of Renler and a wildling with an axe hacking away at each other, seeing Sir Boren cut down another wildling and attempt to reach Jaehaerys' side before being caught up by another. The slight knight of the Kingsguard was limping badly, an arrow with markings matching the one that had felled his horse embedded in the gap of his knee armor. Without truly thinking, Jaehaerys rushed towards him, only as an afterthought stopping by his very dead stallion to cut his shield free. That afterthought was all that saved his life, as an arrow bounced off his shoulder pauldron as the prince bent down. If he hadn't have made the motion, the arrow would have embedded itself in his neck. Jaehaerys shot back to his feet, only half holding onto the shield, and turned to face the archer. He caught a glimpse of the man between a mass of fighting bodies and horses, and inexplicably the prince started towards him, gripping his shield firmly. He charged forward, bashing one wildling locked in battle with one of the retinue knights in the side of the head with his shield. Another wildling, this one roaring like an aurochs and wielding 2 axes, appeared in front of him. Jaehaerys instinctually caught one axe on his shield, and deflected the other with his sword, before pushing forward like a bull, shoving the wildling off balance with his shield and driving his sword into the man's gut. As the second wildling fell, Jaehaerys found himself only a few feet from the archer, an arrow staring at his face. The prince brought his shield up just in time, the arrow digging into the top inch of the banded steel and oak instead of his gray eyes. And with a roar of his own, he slammed into the archer, knocking their slight frame onto their back. Roaring like a dragon or snarling like a wolf, take your pick, he raised his sword, ready to land a killing blow. His blade stopped in midair. Staring up at him was a woman. Her hair was fiery red, her eyes blue-gray. Her bow had been knocked aside, her near-empty quiver of arrows now useless. Fear had covered her features as she stared up at Jaehaerys, her eyes, which were slightly too far apart, pleading, her mouth hanging open to reveal crooked teeth. She was beautiful. His shield and sword dropped, Jaehaerys staring in his own slack-jawed shock and confusion. He couldn't kill a woman, could he? There was no honor in that. A man trying to kill you was one thing, but a woman? Would a true knight do such a thing? His mind was racing with so many questions that he didn't see the glint of victory flash across the wildling girl's eyes until it was too late. A dagger was suddenly in her hands as she lunged at him, the point aiming directly for the gap under his chin. Ymhari's reflexes had no chance of stopping her, and it suddenly occurred to him that he was going to die. But then a sword flashed in, colliding with the dagger and knocking it out of the girl's grip. One whole finger, and part of another went with it. The red-haired wildling barely had time to look at her now maimed hand before a figure closed in, and a gauntleted fist crashed into her cheek, snapping her head around and sending the girl crashing to the snow unmoving. Ymhari's could only stare dumbly at the girl's back, part of his brain registering the rise and fall of her torso indicating she was still alive. His view of her unconscious form was suddenly filled with black armor, and he looked up into his uncle's raging violet eyes. Aelor's voice was sharp and harsh. A woman can kill you just as fast as a man, sometimes even faster. Don't you ever hesitate, it will only get you killed. With his words, his uncle shoved Ymhari's breastplate, sending him staggering back. The motion returned him to his senses, and Ymhari's looked around to see the battle was largely over. A few wildlings still in sight as they scattered like the wind away from the scene of carnage. Bodies of both horse and man littered the blood-soaked snow, some in the furs of the wildling, some in the black of the Night's Watch, and still others in the armor of knights from the retinue. Renler and Balin were both still standing, the former retching out of the eye and visor holes of his helm as he desperately tried to pull the spiked piece of armor off. The latter stood so stonily calm despite the blood on his blade that you'd think he had merely been in a tilt instead of a battle. Sir Boren was limping towards them, armor bloody from both his enemies and the arrow in his leg. Aelor took his scarred helm off, eyes still blazing, but he finally stopped staring a hole in his nephew and instead scanned the rest of Ymhari's, looking for signs of injury and noting the blood coating his arm and sword. When the dragon of Duskendale met his nephew's shocked eyes once again, they were slightly softer. Otherwise you did well for a first battle. I am proud. A slick voice called to his uncle in that moment as the survivors began to act, tending to wounded and taking stock of the carnage. A medium-built man with black hair and pale blue eyes stopped beside them. The man's name was Bronn, a sellsword who had joined Aelor's retinue after assisting in the destruction of House Rogers. While once the men Aelor Targaryen had kept were all knights of high valor, they had been replaced in later years by all sorts of different men. Both high-honored knights and cutthroats. All Aelor seemed to care about now was men who were good at killing, and few were as good at killing as Bronn. Ymhari's didn't like him. He was amoral and a mercenary, only there to get paid. But something about the man's sheer honesty and demeanor prevented Ymhari's from disliking him either. What do you want done with her? Bronn asked, gesturing with a bloody dagger down at the maimed, unconscious wildling. Bronn never lorded or your graced, but Aelor didn't seem to mind. Bronn was excellent at killing after all, and he seemed to understand better than most the hatred and need for blood that Aelor carried with him. Aelor opened his mouth to reply, and Ymhari's was certain would tell Bronn to slit her throat. Uncle, he protested, grasping the dragon of Duskendale's arm, then realizing he didn't know what he was going to say, and slamming his mouth shut so hard his teeth rattled. Even though Ymhari's hadn't put in words, Aelor seemed to understand what he was asking. He stared at his nephew for a long moment before grunting. Bind her hand and take her prisoner, we'll see what she knows. He stopped Ymhari's bubbled thank yous with a sharp glare and raised hand. We'll get the information out of her by whatever means necessary. Do the same for any others left alive. Bronn nodded, whistling and gesturing for two other men. Even as they approached, Aelor turned and remounted warrior, having dismounted in the midst of the fighting for one reason or another. I'm going to head back to the column and get some ravens sent to the other garrisoning parties to be on the lookout. Ymhari stayed rooted in his spot, as one of the men Bronn had called for knelt beside the unconscious wildling, binding the heavily bleeding stump where her fingers had been lopped off. A dark bruise was already beginning to cover half of her beautiful face, where Aelor had landed his fist. He only took his eyes off of her to notice the blood caked on his arm and chest, and then couldn't help but notice her fingers lying in the snow. Unlike Ren, Ymhari's managed to get his helm off before he emptied the contents of his stomach all over the blood-churned snow. Even as he retched over and over, Bronn's amused laugh filling his ears. All Ymhari's could think about was how happy he was the wildling girl wasn't awake to see it. He'd had 4 sons of fighting age that morning. Now he had one, and he wasn't entirely sure of even that. House Grimm of Greyshield had been founded nearly 2,000 years ago, when King Garth Gardner VII had settled the Misty Isles with his strongest warriors to defend against the Ironborn Reavers. In those 2,000 years the Grimms had battled all sorts of enemies, from the Iron Kings to the Durandons to the Lannisters of the Rock and the Martells of Dorne. And they had lived to tell the tales. Now it seemed their line was coming to an end. The Ironborn attack had come out of nowhere, more longships than Lord Guthor Grim had ever seen streaking up the Mander. His own ships had barely been able to deploy before they were swamped by the swift vessels of the Greyjoys, overrun quickly. His Air Horus ship had been the last to go down, boarded and then burned by 3 of the Ironborn vessels as Guthor watched from where he was rallying the men at Grimston to defend the walls of the castle. Guthor was a realist. He knew his oldest would never have stopped fighting for his ship until the breath left his lungs. Horus was dead, so were Lyman and Loras. His twins had been among the first to rally at the gates when the Ironborn flung them open. Guthor had joined them there with his best men, the sea-green banner with its iron studs and longships waving as he tried to prevent the squids from breaching his gates. It had all been for naught, though, as the sheer number of pillagers had overrun the defenders of Grimston's gates. Lyman had died first, cut down by an armored warrior carrying a sword with a moonstone pommel and peculiar blade. Loras had tried to avenge his twin and met the same fate. His throat slashed cleanly by that same odd blade. It was only when the blade had driven into Guthor's guts that he'd recognized it as Valyrian steel. He should never have tried to take on the man who slew his sons. Guthor was an old man, plagued by gout and half a dozen old wounds he'd taken in the wars he'd fought. But the Lord of Greyshield had known he was going to die, and in the last touch of energy that had given him, he had barreled into the Valyrian steel knight. The fight had been savage but short. Guthor was dying, he knew. His old hands couldn't hold all the blood pouring out of his old body. He had never feared death in the prime of his life, and he didn't fear it now at death's doorstep. The sound of feminine screams sounded form inside his keep, and Guthor knew in his heart they belonged to his daughters. His second oldest son Oswell was in there somewhere, trying to protect what remained of the Grim dynasty. Guthor had tried to rise to his feet and assist his son but had been unable, his body no longer able to match the warrior he was at heart. He prayed to the 7 that his youngest children and his wife, the third of his long life, would be able to somehow escape. Leaning against the walls of the castle his family had ruled for generations, Guthor didn't dwell on the death of his house. Instead he looked to the top of Grimston's keep, to the watchtower. A fire roared in its brazier. One the Lord of Greyshield knew would be seen by the other watchtowers, passing the signal of this attack on down the line to the mainland of the Reach. Before long it would reach Highgarden, and the Tyrells would rally their men and throw the Ironborn back into the sea. His dying heart filled with pride at the thought. House Grim would die today, of that there was no doubt, but they had carried out the job they had had for 2,000 years. They had been the shield of the Reach, battling the Reavers and giving the other lords and ladies of the Reach the warning that they themselves hadn't had. House Grim had fulfilled their duty from the beginning to the end. Guthor of Greyshield died with a smile on his face. Word reached King's Landing in a flock of ravens. Tyrion Lannister was handling his duties as regent as capably as his long-dead father had handled being Hand of the King. The halfman was smart. Smarter than anyone Calmer the Grey had ever met, and he didn't let the scoffs and jests at his diminutive stature stop him. The Lion of Lannister was driven and willing, and the Grandmeister of the Iron Throne knew Aegon had chosen well, even if the main reason for the selection had been Tyrion's last name and not his capabilities. But managing a realm during a 16-year peace was one thing. Managing a realm at war was quite another. Calmer hoped the Lion Lord wouldn't falter. Word has reached us from the Shield Isles as well, my lords and lady, the deformed Grandmaster said, taking his seat in the small council chamber and tossing several rolls of parchment onto the table in front of him. The Shield Isles were attacked as well. Greyshield, Greenshield and Southshield have been overrun. Only Oakenshield was able to turn back the original attack, having the benefit of being the closest to land. Old Oak on the coast was taken as well. And the Reavers are swarming Blackcrown. Tyrion's tone was serious, something Calmer rarely heard. What of Old Town and the Arbor? Both have been left unmolested. The Ironborn knew chances of taking either were slim. The Red Wine fleet sailed to try and liberate the taken islands but were met with heavy opposition and turned back. Lord Paxter pleads for naval aid. Bronze Yohn Royce grunted. The squids have been unmolested for years. They took next to no losses in the rebellion. They've been waiting, watching, growing. Tyrion finished. Alysanne Lefford met Calmer's eyes, worry evident in them. What of Highgarden? The entire council knew she was truly asking after Rhaenys and the princess children. They had been Calmer's primary concern as well. Highgarden was forewarned in plenty of time and left untouched. Lord Mace has called his banners, though he too requests military aid. Bronze Yone raised an eyebrow. He has more men than any other region. And he requests our own. Calmer didn't answer. Bronze Yone hadn't been looking for one anyway. The Lord of Runestone had never been fond of Mace Tyrell, a sentiment shared by many of the veterans on both sides of the rebellion. Instead, the Grandmeister gestured towards another of the parchments. The Reavers have hit the Riverlands and Westerlands as well. Cannet was taken and sacked, as was the Crag. Seaguard was attacked, but Lord Jason threw them back into the sea. Balon's heir Roderick Greyjoy fell outside Seaguard's walls. Lord Edmure has called his own banners. Alysanne was a smart woman. Colemmer had seen that the moment he first met her. Her eyes were calculating and fierce. They cannot hope to hold out long. Even with our strongest fighters at the wall, they are outrageously outnumbered. Sir Manfred Dark grunted, face a deeper scowl than normal. He and Sir Roland Storm had been selected to remain at King's Landing and protect the remaining Targaryens. Neither had been pleased about missing the war, but the selection made sense. Roland was a deadly blade and Manfred as fiercely loyal as a man could be. The cunts don't mean to hold the territory. Stanny's Baratheon scowl was nearly as deep as Manfred's. The Ironborn have a stronger navy than both the Red Wines and the Crown individually. They mean to reave the coastal castles and cities, taking loot and salt wives and whisk them away to the Iron Islands. With their own fleets on patrol, there will be no getting them back unless we send the royal fleet to merge with the Red Wines. Tyrion took a gulp of wine. Balon Greyjoy has always hated being a vassal. It's why he makes such a piss-poor one. He turned to Alysanne for a moment before turning back. Forgive my language, my lady. He is nothing like his father. He wants to return to their so-called old way, which is just a religious excuse to rape and murder. Stannis ground his jaw. We must respond to this threat. If we let the heathens raid at will, nothing will be safe. Calmer and several others nodded. I agree. We must. You are correct. Grandmeister, send word to the other regions to closely guard their coasts, and send word to the king of the happenings south of the neck. Lord Stannis, you ate boot leather before yielding a castle in the last war. I suppose fishing for squid is well within your capabilities. Stannis' brow twitched. The Lord of Storm's End had yet to grow fully accustomed to Tyrion's witticism and humor, and Calmer secretly doubted he ever would. I'll take the fleet from Dragonstone and merge with the Red Wines. Leave some of the ships here, Lord Stannis. All eyes turned to Alysanne, whose own were clouded in thought. There is something off about all of this. Lord Varys' chittering voice was heard for the first time. Lady Alysanne has a point. Balon Greyjoy and his 3 sons went reaving in Essos for a long while this year, though they did little actual reaving. My little birds say he had several meetings with different men but were unable to overhear their conversations. They took heavy precautions. Tyrion was eyeing the spider closely. Who were these men? I could not say. The songs I heard were incomplete. Both parties were very careful to leave no indications of what they were speaking of or who the second party was. Bronze Yone's brows were furrowed. Could it be a coalition of free cities? No, ground out Sir Manfred. We provide them with a large portion of their goods trade. They do not attack paying clients. The eastern shits are pompous and greedy but not stupid. Then who? Manfred shrugged. I don't bloody know. It could be something or nothing at all. The conversation waged on over the issue for several hours. Alysanne leading the argument for leaving a strong naval presence on the eastern coast, while Stannis argued that they needed to worry with the current threat for now, as he would need a strong navy to counter the Ironborn's superior experience at naval warfare. Tyrion led them to compromise in the end, wearing Stannis down to leaving 10 high-quality ships and crews to defend the eastern coast, while he took the rest to the west and the Ironborn. Calmer was tasked with alerting the lords to the ongoing issues, and passing orders to Edmure Tully and Jason Mallister to assemble a force at Seaguard. Once Stannis broke the Iron Fleet, they were to invade Pike, while the Reach and Mace Tyrell would invade Great and Old Wyke. Word was sent to Prince Doran in Dorne, requesting he task Oberyn with collecting a force of Dornishmen to assist the Reach, while simultaneously strengthening his own port cities. The council adjourned in the late hours of the night. As they shuffled out of the small council chamber, Calmer couldn't help but notice the apprehension still on Alysanne's face. He wondered why it was echoed in his own chest. The timing was brilliant, almost too brilliant to have been planned by mere mortals. Varys was unrivaled as a spymaster, none could contest that fact. Yet even the spider and all his little birds had been caught unawares. By the time the Iron Throne knew of the approaching fleet, cell sails mainly, a conglomeration of vessels from all different ports and cultures, all flying the banner of the Golden Company, it was much too late to recall Lord Stannis. The tall, stern Lord of the Stormlands had taken almost all of the Royal Navy from Dragonstone and King's Landing and sailed down the coast to deal with the cursed Ironborn. The Krakens hadn't let up. sacking Fair Isle and putting nearly all of House Farman to the sword. Only one, a young squire named Albar serving with her husband at the wall, was left of the ancient line. They Greyjoys had kept mainly to the coastline of the still weakened Westerlands, though a few sorties inland had been made. One such had been crushed beneath the walls of Crakehall by Roland and Lyle Crakehall. Another had taken and burned Cornfield and captured Sir Harry's Swift. Feastfires was embroiled in a vicious melee of a siege, the Bulls of Prester refusing to yield their castle to the Squids, who were just as adamant about getting in and pillaging her treasuries. The Reach was in slightly better condition, though not much. The fourth and final of the Shield Isles had fallen to young Theon Greyjoy, though the Reavers at Blackcrown had been pushed back. Old Oak was still in Greyjoy hands as well, and Dunstonbury was threatened. Old Town and the Arbor remained unmolested, but Paxter Redwine and his fleet were still playing a cat-and-mouse game with the larger Iron Fleet. Despite the breadth of the Greyjoy attack, there were always enough longships supporting one another that the Lord of the Arbor couldn't engage one numerically weaker foe without others arriving in the midst of battle and driving him back. Meanwhile, castles and towns burned, innocents died by the score, and women and children were carried away as salt wives and thralls. It was hell on the western coastline of Westeros. It seemed it was about to be hell on the eastern coastline as well. Alysanne Lefford was as well educated as any other on the history of the Golden Company and their ties to the dynasty she had married into, founded by Eager Rivers, one of King Aegon the Unworthy's great bastards, who was better known as Bittersteel. Their purpose was to subdue the Targaryen dynasty and place a Blackfire, a house spawned from another of the great bastards, on the Iron Throne. Their ranks were swelled with exiled Westerosi lords, men who had lost their lands and titles fighting for the Black Dragon and who had joined their best means of regaining them. Their sons served in the company, then their sons after them. 5 times these mercenaries and the nobles among them had tried to return home, and each time they had been thrown back. The Blackfire line had ended alongside that 5th attempt, snuffed out by a young Barristan the Bold, but now it seemed these men had found another way to justify their invasion. Thousands of men were sailing towards a suddenly undefended King's Landing under the Golden Skull's banner, and the Golden Dragons, for all her efforts. She had never been able to form the relationship Alysanne had with Aegon and Rhaenys with Viserys. Nearly all of that had been the boy's fault. He was surly and unpredictable, even as the 6-year-old grief-stricken little boy he had been when Alysanne first met him. He was inflicted with Targaryen madness even at that tender age, it was true, and the death of his mother while birthing Princess Daenerys had further unglued the unstable child. Regardless, Alysanne and Aelor had provided and loved for Viserys as best they could, though he had turned into a notorious rake, as evidenced by the 2 bastard little girls here in King's Landing, and his obsession with Dany was both fierce and fiercely disturbing. Viserys had turned out far better than he could have. While Viserys had never returned the affection Alysanne showed him and by no stretch of the imagination was close to any of her children, he did seem to care greatly for the Targaryen name and those who bore it, which made this betrayal all the more confounding and painful. Part of her mind still argued that it was a ploy, the banners cited by the fishermen and ambitious merchants who had reported them, only an attempt by the Golden Company to rattle the Targaryens in King's Landing. But in her heart Alysanne knew. Viserys had disappeared months ago, neither Aleku Garantes or Varys little birds able to find him in the Tyroshi tavern he had made his home. Wherever the boy had gone, he had done a marvelous job of covering his tracks. Many, even Alysanne herself, had just assumed the Prince of Summerhall had gone rogue, taking the time of his exile to explore more of the free cities. Now it seemed he had joined a rebellion and was sailing to attack the family that had loved him. As if Alysanne's hands weren't full enough, each member of the small council looked as harried as she felt, eyes bloodshot and jaws clenched. Word had arrived the night before of the approaching fleet, and while a ship had been sent to chase down the weeks-gone Lord Stannies and Ravens were sent to call the banners, all knew those efforts were in vain. The bulk of the Crown's forces were in the north, King Aegon having taken the levies of Duskendale and Harrenhal in addition to his own sizable retinue and the retinues of most of the lords in King's Landing, including Aelor's band of killers. The Riverlanders and many of the Valemen were amassing at Seaguard, the Reachmen were swarming to Highgarden, and the Westerlanders were covered in Ironborn raiders. The North was also embroiled in whatever the hell was going on at the Wall, with the remnants of her strength distracted by the potential for Ironborn raiders off her shores. The Dornish were moving to assist the Reach, and the Stormlords, those that hadn't sailed with Lord Stannies, were lacking a strong central figure to unite them. As Renly Baratheon was who the hell knows where. Not to mention, several still held hatred for Aelor, and by default Aegon for both Robert's nearly successful rebellion and House Roger's doomed one. That left the capital mighty short-handed, even with the levies of the Kingswood and Blackwater Rush called, and the presence of the strong city's watch. It was unfathomable how nearly 17 years of strong, capable rule had so quickly gone to utter shit. One of the only positives, perhaps the only positive, of the situation was Tyrion Lannister's brilliant mind. The halfmen had leapt into action before the shock of the situation had even sunk into the others, having nearly emptied the extensive rookery with sent orders. There are thousands of bloodthirsty men knocking at our door. They will not show us an ounce of mercy, nor should we show any to them. Bronze Yohn Royce was grim and irritable. Having spent all the previous night overseeing the defenses his gold cloaks had hastily begun constructing, but he kept his tone even as he responded. The lighting of the lions was one thing, this is another. Tyrion's mismatched eyes flashed. Do not tell me of the burning of Lannisport, Lord Royce. Unlike you, I was there. I watched from the windows of my old chambers in Casterly Rock as Aelor Targaryen burnt down my family's city, and nearly all of my kinsmen with it. It was undeniably effective, the type of effectiveness we need now. The loss of life at Lannisport was astounding, pointed out Calmer the Grey, to which Tyrion had an instant rebuttal. Then again, Tyrion always had an instant rebuttal. Matching wits with Tyrion Lannister was an undertaking few could boast of. The loss of life here in King's Landing will be astounding if we do not use our only advantage. At most we have 4,000 men defending a city of 500,000 innocents against perhaps 10,000 professional soldiers. No help is near enough to arrive in time to be of use. Half of the country is preoccupied with defending their own borders. Alysanne spoke up, the men growing quiet as she did so. I understand that the Ironborn are clearly allied with Viserys in this, but what does he hope to gain from this? He is horribly outnumbered. I agree, Lady Alysanne, but those armies are spread far and wide. Some in Westeros will rally to Prince Viserys to elevate their standing, or in revenge against your husband for the wars of the past. Despite my name, I am loyal to the Iron Throne, but there are many in the Westerlands who want nothing more than to see Aelor Targaryen dead. And my lady, Calmer cut in, you and your children are here. There is nothing on this earth that matters more to Aelor and Aegon than their family. If he captures you, he holds a major card in getting what he wants. And we all know precisely what that is, Varys finished. The spider having approached her with information before the meeting that Alysanne prayed they wouldn't need to use. Manfred spoke, harsh voice grown harsher in light of the new complications. Then let them leave. Slip them out, send them north to the king or south to the Dornish. Prince Oberyn will protect them like his own children. Royce nodded. And his daughter Aelia is already in the capital as a handmaiden to Princess Rhaella, strengthening that bond. Bronze Yohn grunted. Though I've never saw the girl act anything like a lady-in-waiting, she's always in the stables. Tyrion looked to Alysanne, ignoring the Lord of Runestone's final comment. That may well be the best course of action, my lady, though I would hear your thoughts on the matter. Alysanne pondered a long moment, bloodshot eyes on the parchment in front of her before looking up. Where will we go, my lords? Highgarden is dangerously near the Reavers. My father's castle is in the middle of a maelstrom of fire, and we would be tracked down and captured long before we reach Sunspear. Royce blinked in slight confusion. Your husband is Lord of Duskendale, and 2/3 of Duskendale's population came from Lannisport after my husband burned it to the ground. While they have prospered there, it is no secret that many still hold hatred for Aelor for forcing them from their homes and businesses, even after nearly 2 decades. While we were always safe there before, Aelor was always present when my children and I were there. And the only thing they feel more for Aelor than hatred is fear. With a realm at chaos and my husband hundreds of miles away, Varys nodded. Lady Alysanne has a valid point. My little birds have rooted out many conspiracies from former Tywin Lannister smallfolk over the years. Manfred's hateful eyes turned even more hateful, yet they missed a fucking army massing to invade. Varys was unimpressed by Manfred's threatening voice. My birds sing in the east and they sing in the west, but their songs can be silenced. It was a concentrated effort to hide the Golden Company from my view, one helped by some here in Westeros, though their names are unknown to me. Manfred lowered his head to glower across the table at the eunuch like a bull preparing to charge. Or you are that assistant. Varys chuckled in his tittering way. If I had wished to replace Aegon Targaryen with Viserys, I would simply have let the boy die during Robert's rebellion. We both know I did no such thing. Sir Manfred, you were there when I saved the king's young life. The brutish knight of the Kingsguard grunted in annoyance, but he raised his head a touch in deference. The exchange in Varys' words brought up a point Alysanne wished to make, concerning the information Varys had given her before the meeting. Lord Varys has informed me of how Princess Aelia and her children escaped the sack of King's Landing. That option should be available again should Lord Tyrion's plan fail. Manfred shook his head quickly. Viserys escaped the same way. The little shit caused quite the ruckus. He'll know about that secret passage, and at the very least he'll have a ship waiting in the bay to capture any who exit it. There are other paths, Sir Manfred, Varys insisted. Several were built in recent years under the command of Lord Aelor himself. I trust if King's Landing falls I can evacuate Lady Alysanne and the royal family, the same as I did years ago with the king and his sister. And the children of important families. Tyrion cut in, having kept his silence for much longer than the halfmen normally did. Margaery Tyrell, Elias and Michella, we can't have the children of vassal lords dying while the royal family escapes. A pang went through Alysanne at the mention of the last name. I'd nearly forgotten about that particular issue. Alysanne loved her eldest son, but she would strangle him with her bare hands when he returned from the wall. Michella had arrived back in King's Landing in tears a little over a month after the king and Renler and Alaric had gone north. To Alysanne's utmost surprise, her mother had been with her. Cersei Lannister was a cold, unforgiving woman, but she cared deeply for her children. Deeply enough that she had traveled to the city where her father had made his gravest mistake to talk to the wife of the man that had brought him low and asked, in her demanding, Cersei Lannister way, that they pull off a deception for the sake of her blonde-haired eldest. Michella Langward had been married to Renler Targaryen in a private ceremony the day before the march north. At least, that was the belief of the nobles in King's Landing. The child growing in her womb was a legitimate future lord or lady of Duskendale, not a bastard conceived of two young nobles' rash decisions on the eve of one marching away to war. Alysanne had promised both Michella and Cersei that the union would be truly carried out as soon as her eldest son returned, no matter what objections her lustful son might have. She meant to carry that promise out, even if she had to turn her much larger than her son over her knee like he was a toddler again. Only a few outside the three women involved were aware of the truth, Daenerys and Rhaella, as they were old enough to know that there was no possible way they would not have been informed of the match. Calmer the Grey and Varys because they knew everything that happened in the Red Keep, and Tyrion because he was much too smart to deceive when it came to his favorite niece. He'd been crucial in the success of the plan so far, covering for the gap between the marriage and the revelation of it to the nobles in a way only his brilliant mind could. He'd also made sure no letters of congratulations were sent north to Alaric or Aelor, or heaven forbid Renler himself, claiming Michella didn't want word of her condition distracting her husband or father. It was thin and it was doubted by several, but with the influence of Varys it had been maintained. Thank the Seven for it too. If Aelor doesn't kill our son for disobeying his orders to not seduce Michella, Alaric will. I only pray Cersei can convince her husband it was a mutual decision between Michella and Ren, or there will be 7 hells to pay. All of that ran through her head in a matter of moments. Bronze Yohn speaking again. That is all well and good, my lady, but I still disagree with Lord Tyrion's plans. Lannisport was a horrifying thing that my eldest son still has nightmares about, despite his bravery. I shudder at the thought of another. This is a war, Lord Royce. The men approaching our city will give no mercy to either you or I. Why should we show any to them? The galleys we have are not enough. Tyrion took a long gulp of wine, clearly irritated. This is their best use. It may not be honorable, but it may keep our heads on our shoulders a while longer. I don't know about you, Lord Royce, but I am quite fond of my own. Calmer interrupted then, booming voice gone quiet as it so often did when he mediated arguments between the council. Aelor once told me that honor is the first casualty of war. He sacrificed his own, and by doing so he brought the realm nearly 17 years of peace, only undone by the greed and lust of a few powerful men. Royce stared at the Grandmeister, eyes twitching before cursing under his breath. Fine. Tyrion nodded in thanks to Calmer. I will make preparations immediately. Before another word could be said, a Targaryen man-at-arms burst into the chamber. An army approaches from the south, my lords, my lady. Alysanne's heart soared with hope. What banner is it, Prince Oberyn? The man-at-arms' face was as confused as his voice. No, my lady, they bear the black stag of Baratheon. It is a miracle Renly and Stannis Baratheon are brothers, while both men were tall, black-haired, and blue-eyed. That was where the similarities stopped. Stannis was muscular where Renly was lean, balding while Renly wore his hair to his shoulders. He was grim and sullen, whereas his younger brother was always smiling and jovial. Stannis wore almost exclusively black from his everyday clothing to his armor, while Renly rode into King's Landing in a suit of green and gold plate. Stannis hated pomp and circumstance while Renly seemed to thrive on it. Alysanne also trusted Stannis, and she sure as hell didn't trust Renly. The youngest of the 3 Baratheon brothers had brought nearly 10,000 men with him, and the first thing Alysanne had noticed was how young they all were. Renly himself was 22, and his second in command seemed to be the even younger Loras Tyrell, who seemed to have forsaken his sieged homeland to relieve the sieged capital. Boys, much like her Renler and Aemon, made up the vast majority of their forces. The knights, with the exception of a few hedge knights, were all young men, too young to have seen the rebellion. It was painfully clear to Alysanne that they were all Spitfires, desperate for a war to prove themselves in, dragging along their father's levies or their own in the case of young lords. Those were the first things she had noticed. The second thing she had noticed was the houses they all seemed to be from. These were not Stormlord's levies and retinues, though a few were speckled in. Though the banners they flew were all the Baratheon flag, the surcoats and shields of the men themselves told the true story. There were a conglomeration of eagles and deer and bulls, all sorts of animals and sigils, boars of Crakehall, golden coins of Pain, candles of Waxley. To a man, the shields and surcoats were from houses that had warred against the Targaryens near 2 years ago. That was the first warning bell. Alysanne instantly noticed the plethora of 3 buckles on a blue field. The sigil of House Buckler, that was the second. Their lord, a tall and stern-faced man of 23 named Andras, sat a grey stallion near the front of the procession of nobles. His presence turned Alysanne's feelings of relief and hope into a conglomeration of anxiety and concern. Andras was half Rogers, his mother having been from the house that Aelor had destroyed so thoroughly. While Lysa Rogers had been a kind woman who had cooperated with Aelor during the rebellion, opening the gates of Bronzegate to save her husband and brother, Alysanne had no doubt Aelor would have killed her had she still been alive after her brother's attempts to assassinate Alysanne and Renler had come to light. It was through luck, for House Buckler, not for Lysa, that an illness had taken her and her third child mere months before the purge that claimed the lives of all her father's family. Lord Ralph had joined her in the grave 5 years later. Lord Andras had been 8 when his uncles and cousins were all killed, and he hadn't had to suffer his mother dying the same way. But Alysanne was under no illusions as to just what the man must think of Aelor, and his presence and the presence of all his knights and levies worried her. Renly, however, was doing his best to assuage those fears. Lady Alysanne, an honor to see you again. The dashing Baratheon dismounted a white stallion straight from a song, his green helm adorned with the antlers of a stag. Just like Robert's had been, he struts like a king, not like a man fourth in line for a single region. Alysanne's unease grew even as she curtsied in response to Renly's own short bow. Lord Renly, the honor is mine, especially in these circumstances. Tyrion bowed as well, smiling up at the tall Baratheon. She had been on the small council with Tyrion Lannister long enough, however, to see her own concerns were running through his mismatched eyes. You have come at an excellent time, Lord Renly. Your timing was nearly uncanny. If Renly was here to sack instead of save, he was excellent at hiding it. His smile was smooth and natural. While my brother was preparing to sail, my companions and I took it upon ourselves to gather men to aid in repelling the Ironborn from our coasts. It was through sheer luck that we were passing through Dalston Keep when word of your impending trouble reached us. We turned north to the capital as soon as we heard. Renly looked around, smile never faltering. I take it we're not too late. Quite the contrary, Tyrion replied cheerily, though Alysanne knew he was anything but cheerful inside. You're just in time. Though just what Renly Baratheon and his companions were in time for was looking more and more doubtful. Lasswell Peake was sailing home. Over 100 years prior, his great-grandfather had been exiled from the Reach, stripped of his lordship of Dunstonbury, and his castle of the same name by King Daeron Targaryen II. House Peake had fought to but a Blackfire on the Iron Throne and had lost 2 of the 3 castles that to this day were represented on their family banner. Only distant kin still occupied Starpike in Westeros, the lucky branch of the family that had been granted clemency while the others had foundered. Now, after 3 generations and 4 more wars attempting to overthrow the Red Dragon, Lasswell and his brothers sailed to fight a Targaryen again, only this time they intended to place a different one on the throne. The man they fought for now, Viserys Targaryen, wasn't much of a dragon, and Lasswell doubted he'd be much of a king either. The lad, for he still acted like a boy despite his age, was damn near insufferable at times, his new power seemingly going to his head, and was as unforgiving of slights both real and perceived as he was impatient to claim his throne. But that mattered little to Lasswell. He didn't give a damn who sat on the Iron Throne at the end of this war, be it Aegon VI or Viserys III or even bloody Harry Strickland I. He didn't give much of a damn what kind of king Viserys might make either, be he the second coming of Jaehaerys the Conciliator or Meager the Cruel. All Lasswell Peake cared about was Dunstonbury, the home he had been raised hearing about but had never so much as stood on the same continent as. The Ironborn, their allies in this invasion, had been warned away from doing damage to Duskendale, despite its close proximity to the coast of the Reach. Instructed to forego battering rams and looting, although they were welcome to take the castle from the squatting house Dunstan. The wretched filth had been awarded Duskendale just as soon as Lasswell's great-grandfather had had it revoked, even though they hadn't a drop of noble blood in their veins. Their founder had been a simple man-at-arms who had, to the vast benefit of his children, saved Leo Longthorn Tyrell on the Redgrass Field, where Demon Blackfire and the rebellion had died. The man had named his new dynasty after the castle they had usurped, as if he had had a right to it. The audacity boiled Lasswell's blood to this day. He hoped the Ironborn starved the Dunstans slowly, but he wouldn't complain too much if they didn't. If they left him 1 or 10 to torture to death, that would be acceptable as well. But this was all after they had defeated the current Targaryens, no mean feat. The king they intended to usurp was a competent young man who had ruled well when given the chance, though he wasn't the one to be concerned with. It was the uncle, the Dragon of Duskendale, whom the council had decided was the biggest obstacle to their effort, and would remain so despite being with Aegon the 6,000s of miles away. While his brutality had swelled their ranks to be sure, many nobles with grudges old and new opting to swear for Viserys simply to see the burner of Lannisport fall, fear of him also held many lords in place. If this strike on the capital worked as was planned, allowing them to capture the dragon's loved ones, they could remove him. For all his ruthlessness, Aelor Targaryen was known to value nothing in the Seven Kingdoms more than his family. The Golden Company would trade them, his family, for the glue to the Targaryen dynasty and then execute him. And then, without fear of his martial ability or of his vicious retribution, lords would flock to Viserys' banner. Or so that was the plan. The first step in it all was the capture of King's Landing, and as Lasswell and the ship beneath his feet neared the future Lord of Dunstonbury was reaffirmed that they would do so. A Baratheon banner billowed above the ramparts of the Mud Gate. Lasswell knew for a certainty that they weren't those of Stannis, the Lord of the Stormlands, for now, anyway, had taken the bait the Ironborn represented. Sailing the strength of the Royal Navy and thousands of soldiers around the broken arm of Dorne to relieve the beaten and bloody coastlines of the Reach and Westerlands. That meant the banners currently flapping in the wind represented one thing: Renly had successfully relieved King's Landing. The Golden Company was likely sailing towards gates that would wing open as they made landfall. While the prevalence of red Targaryen dragons meant Renly either hadn't begun or hadn't finished his coup, the appearance of the fleet would kick him into action. The only true obstacle between Viserys and the city of his birth was the small fleet of ships left behind by Stannis, a token lot that Renly couldn't insist to help man without raising too much suspicion. But as the ship beneath him neared, Lasswell had been awarded a place of honor aboard the first ship in the line, a position won by flattering Viserys in one of the council discussions. He saw that even that token fleet wasn't moving, save for one. It struck him as odd. The capital surely had known of the nearing Golden Company fleet for days. The fishing boats that had been allowed to return and give warning, as well as signal Renly, certainly telling of the Golden Skull banner. The captains and crews of this last line of naval defense should have been on high alert, ready to leap into defense of the Blackwater Bay as soon as the Golden Company came into view, but all but one stayed stationary, and even it was moving slowly, rudderless and choppy. And all of a sudden, Lasswell Peak became uneasy. I have earned this. It was the millionth time he'd told himself that since he'd arrived in the city, but Renly Baratheon still didn't quite believe it. His brother would kill him for this should Stannis survive the battles with the Ironborn. While Renly didn't care for his elder brother, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted him to die either. Renly certainly held no malice for his niece or nephews. Shireen was in truth a charming girl despite the toll Grayscale had taken on her, and the boys had done nothing to Renly themselves. But Renly would make a better lord than Stannis ever could, and while the third Baratheon brother was a man of different taste than most, he certainly didn't lack in ambition. Yet he wasn't heartless, and he knew Stannis must die. And though Renly knew there was no turning back, not now. And he knew Stannis was in his way from ascending to the rule of the Stormlands that he deserved, Renly hesitated, and hesitated, and hesitated. His men waited for an order he had yet to give, ready to turn on the men in golden cloaks and Targaryen livery, to slaughter them to a man and open the gates of King's Landing to the invading army of sellswords. Loras stood beside him, ready to plunge his talented blade into the back of Kedge, a low-born captain in the city watch. He was the commandant of the defenses of the Mud Gate, along with several hundred gold cloaks, the commander of the city watch. A grim man of House Bywater named Jacelyn but called Ironhand was at the Red Keep, along with most of his strongest fighters and the strongest of the knights left in the city. Renly had protested weakly when none of his men had been stationed within the Red Keep itself, Alysanne Targaryen and Tyrion Lannister politely, but firmly declining the offer of his best swords, and Renly had been unable to press the matter for fear of proving his true intentions. Though it seemed they had gathered those intentions already. Every Targaryen in the city, as well as the sons and daughters of nobles serving as pages or squires throughout King's Landing, had been drawn back under the protection of the remaining Kingsguard and men loyal to Aegon. Renly knew they wanted to trust him, but wisely they had opted not to. That made this job much more difficult, as did the fact that Renly had no idea what was going on in the bay at the moment. The Golden Company neared. Their ships already entering Blackwater Bay, yet none of the few ships of the Royal Navy below showed any sign of crews preparing them for battle. Only one ship sailed to counter the invasion force, and it was floating forward at an infuriatingly slow pace. No crew stirred on its deck, no doomed captain shouted orders. It seemed a ghost ship, steadily but slowly plowing forward to its demise. Renly watched, unable to give the order to turn as the ships neared. Something about it drawing his entire focus. He heard the shouts of the men of the Golden Company as the lead ship crossed paths with the slowly moving sole defender of the bay, yet the sound of whistling arrows or calls to board were not among them. Next to him Kedge raised a big arm and in it a banner, and as he chopped it down like an axe on the executioner's block, the banner thrown to the ground below them, Renly realized he had hesitated too long. The shouts of panic from the Golden Company's ship were easily heard even from here. Renly added his own voice to the maelstrom, bellowing out now, and drawing his sword even as Loras drew his own and buried it to the hilt in Kedge's back, the big gold-cloaked captain falling to his knees. Even as trumpets blared their signal and the butchery began all around him, gold cloaks and Targaryen soldiers murdered by the hundreds in the space of a few seconds. Renly knew he had waited too long. Though nothing could truly be heard above the sounds of death and treachery all around him, Renly heard a song. It wasn't playing in reality, he knew, for even if it was, it'd be drowned out by the death cries and enraged roars of King Landing's true defenders, but Renly heard it clear as day in his mind. As a single flaming arrow floated through the air, fired from some place other than the battlements, a violin played a song of a long-ago act by a long-dead man. The story said Aelor Targaryen had played the same song in the moments before he had destroyed Lannisport, to the terror of those both enemy and friend. It terrified Renly now, all these years later, as he helplessly watched the arrow fall to the water in the wake of the single Royal Navy ship. And then, just as Lannisport had 17 years prior, Blackwater Bay exploded.